And so we begin way back in the 1960s. On a day unlike any other, when Stan Lee was tasked by the then owner of what was called Timely Comics to create a team of Marvel-based superheroes. Though the task was simple enough, and by this time DC Comics had done quite a bit with the idea of superhero teams, the Avengers, as it initially was created, still made waves in the history of Western comic book storytelling. Working at the side of Jack Kirby using characters the two men had already created in other books, and later working with various other writers and artists across the first 34 issues, Stan Lee crafted a superhero team truly unlike any other seen before. The Avengers didn't come first in terms of using a team of pre-existing superheroes. That idea was decades old by now, but it certainly changed the game when it came to how these stories were told. Reading these early Avengers books very much feels like Kirby and Lee deserve to be viewed as these pioneers of superhero comics, whereas the early DC teams felt like relatively standard stories with pretty static rosters and fairly straightforward superhero adventures, often with the members of the team not even really working together at all. Lee and Kirby crafted a dynamic team in the form of the Avengers, one that used a wide roster of rotating characters with rather complicated stories to them, while the Avengers as a series would involve ongoing plot threads and story arcs across multiple issues, which at the time was very rare and novel. While the first 34 issues of the Avengers series is way ahead of its time and game-changing in terms of what it did to superhero comics, it's all pretty standard stuff one would expect from Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and the others at Timely Comics around this time period. The end result for the Avengers is pretty amazing to think about. The Hulk, a founding member of the team, quit immediately after the first issue. Captain America suddenly and famously returned from a block of ice in the fourth book, destined to become one of the most prominent members in the team's history. And while a legend did begin as he joined Thor, Iron Man, Wasp, and Giant Man for a solid run of great adventures, this famous iteration of the team only lasted for 12 issues or so before they disbanded, with only Captain America remaining behind to lead then newcomers Hawkeye, Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver, all of whom were former villains. This kind of stuff is all basic Avengers history that most people should be familiar with, and all goes into the earliest roots of Marvel itself. But when you look at what the norm was in terms of what kind of content was coming out of stories like Justice League and other superhero comics at this time, this stuff is way ahead of the game. The Avengers set the precedent early and often that anything could happen at any given moment in their series. Wonder Man, Baron Zemo, Kang the Conqueror, Count Nefaria, Black Widow, all of these were established as part of Avengers mythology in these early days at a shocking pace. Many of these ideas still define the Avengers today, especially when it comes to the world of Marvel and how all these elements of magic, technology, and science fiction blend together in a shared universe. That was all figured out and defined early on in these books. So much of the early artwork is astonishing across these 34 issues, especially relative to the 1963 and 64 publication dates these books carry. That shouldn't be much of a surprise for Jack Kirby, but it's still amazing how often I would turn the page and just be astonished at the cool, creative stuff I was looking at. Stan Lee's writing, which was always a bit subversive and definitely written with an intentional push against authoritarian norms and beliefs of the era. It was still present in his writing here, but that stuff isn't played up too much here, and even without those things, the Avengers in these early days is nothing but good, clean, well-executed fun, made by the best in the business at the time. I found it very easy to like these books and very much used the Stan Lee and Jack Kirby era of Avengers to sort of set the standard for how we'll be grading the rest of the series going forward. This dynamic energy of introducing new characters, bringing in new content, while also telling a good story, that's the sort of thing I would expect, or at least want, out of any given run of Avengers creators going forward. Early on in this grading process, I gave the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby era an A+, and never felt the need to deviate from it as we got closer to my final grades. With the goal in mind to grade these comics relative to the standards the Avengers as a series has come to set for itself over time, in no small part because of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby to begin with. Given the time when these comics were published, that they are critical in forming the team and series itself into the beloved franchise it would eventually become today, and how the events of these books hold key significance not just in Avengers history but Marvel as a whole, and even storytelling beyond that, well, the A+ seems clearly deserved. We've never really given out grades before here on Comic Island, and for good reason, but it's the whole point of this series. The reason being, I want to see not so much how Avengers compares to every other possible comic out there, because there's so many things out there that it's just not an appropriate comparison to. I don't know how the Stan Lee Jack Kirby era relates against something like, say, Mouse? But those aren't an appropriate comparison, and that's where I feel grading is ultimately pointless. And if we're talking in general, I don't know if this would get an A+. But by dividing the Avengers series up amongst its creative teams over time, we can use these grades as a sort of comparison tool against the Avengers series itself. A sort of index to see if the series gets better or worse over time, and how that relates to other Avengers comics, which will set its own average. In the case of the Avengers, it's a pretty uphill battle to go up against Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, so it shouldn't surprise anyone that these two ended up getting, well, the highest grade I can give. You should also know that I went out of my way to make sure the grades I gave, ranging from an F to an A+, are deliberately done in a way that they will be spread out evenly across these different eras of Avengers comics. That means I've already given out one of only 2 A+ I have to award to any of the eras of Avengers. That's the whole point of this little game. If we consider this Stan Lee Jack Kirby era among the best of the Avengers out there, and some other series of Avengers books are given an F grade and defined as the worst among the Avengers out there, then the rest of the series can fall in between these two extremes and give us a sense of how it changed over time. With that in mind, as the Avengers grew in success, so did Stan Lee. His duties increased at the newly renamed Marvel Comics, and he began to have less and less time for writing. The writing duties for the Avengers series was shared more and more with others. One of those new writers would gradually take over writing the Avengers on an ongoing, permanent basis, and his name is Roy Thomas. When Stan Lee had left the writing duties of Avengers, Roy Thomas was chosen to take over. He was among a handful of writers who had worked on the series before Stan Lee had fully stepped back, and my guess is that Thomas, then still in his late 20s, clearly showed some potential and was allowed to write the Avengers on a continuous basis starting at issue 35. Thomas would continue to do so on a largely uninterrupted basis with the occasional guest writer, all the way to number 105, and to date, Roy Thomas has thus written more books of the core Avengers series than just about any writer, depending on how you look at these things. It's quite the achievement, but looking over Roy Thomas's run of Avengers books, I do have to say, on the whole, it makes sense why Marvel chose to stick with him for so long. Though it takes a little while for Thomas to really find a sense of what he wanted the Avengers to be. Once he got going, I really like his books. Bolstering this was the fact that he was regularly partnered with 2 excellent artists that bring his vision to life. Legendary figures in Marvel history, the brothers Sal and John Buschema. While Lee was deeply influential in establishing so much of the Avengers mythology right out of the gate, Thomas, in comparison, largely focused on developing this existing mythology and fleshing it out a little bit. He did great work in building up existing characters while increasing the scale and sophistication of Avengers stories as he shepherded the series through the 1960s and even into the early 70s, although that creative strength definitely wanes late into his time with the Avengers run. The Avengers followed the larger pattern of the comic book industry's transition from the Silver to the Bronze Age that was going on during this period. Reflecting this, the Avengers became more serious and ambitious, while also focusing on more culturally relevant and political issues. Similar to the Stan Lee Jack Kirby era, compared to what I usually read from comics published around this time period, the Avengers feel ahead of the game. The stories are fun and full of memorable moments, and personally I really like Thomas's particular blend of writing. The Kree-Skrull War is a good example of how he tends to consistently operate. Thomas is able to increase the complexity of Avengers stories without compromising the fun or accessibility of the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby era. As much as I like the initial run of Avengers comics, their biggest limitation is how much they were written to a younger audience. In contrast, I feel the Thomas Buschema era hits a greater balance in making these stories more complex without really compromising its all-ages nature. That really remains a core part of Avengers to this day. Development, in my eyes, is the key word to understanding Avengers books from this time period. Thomas didn't introduce a ton of characters, although there are a number of very notable exceptions to what I just said. The three that stand out are Black Knight, the Squadron Supreme, and the biggest name to emerge in all of this, Vision, another core member of the Avengers that is an integral part to this team's history. Though all of these characters are solid additions to the cast of Marvel as a whole, to varying degrees, what Thomas did best, rather than introducing new characters, was build up existing ones and developing their shared universe to a significant extent. A lot of key ideas really feel like they got firmed up in this time period, where Stan Lee's era largely just introduced these concepts, even stuff like Lee's subtle push towards a more diverse cast of superheroes. All these things were better realized here, especially that diversity thing, which was done through a series of Black Panther-led stories during the Thomas era. Similarly, Thomas brought on existing characters like the aforementioned Black Panther, along with the likes of Hercules. With Vision, these three would go on to be essential members of Avengers history, all the way up to present day. Early stories like the marriage between Wasp and Hank Pym, who had become Yellow Jacket during this era, I enjoyed a great deal too. This book is full of light moments that do a lot to set up this team's history, and a lot of early character development that is now baked into the identities of these heroes. It was pretty rare for me to open up any given comic from this time period and find myself disappointed. A random issue could have Black Panther going up against one of his villains, the Skrulls tricking the team into breaking up, or the Enchantress messing around with her usual villainy, and each time I found the books rewarding and worth reading. It's a nice, reliable quality that unfortunately we cannot expect throughout all Avengers comics. While I found some of the artwork early on a bit repetitive and stilted, much like Thomas's writing in those early days, once Thomas had found his footing, and with him the Buschemas, it was so impressive the work they would put together. They managed to still show off cool imagery that almost lives up to the Jack Kirby era, all the while matching the fun and dramatic elements of Thomas's writing. Avengers books from this time could be fun, serious, imaginative, whatever the situation called for. I mention and throw a lot of credit towards John and Sal Buschema, both of whom very much stand out in Avengers history. But I don't want to discount the work of people like Gene Colan either. All told, this and the Stan Lee era encompass what I have come to think of as the true classic era of Avengers. The core part of the original series that established the team, its core members, a number of key moments in various characters' histories, all while feeling a little ahead of their time. These books largely hold up in spite of being decades old, and don't feel nearly as dated as other comics we'll talk about that come out later in Avengers history. And nothing will ever come after this in terms of Avengers chronology that would ever quite feel the same. Unfortunately, when it comes to the first volume of Avengers comics, rarely would those changes ultimately be for the better. In fact, I would go so far as to say it would be decades before the Avengers ever managed to top the Thomas Buschema era of comics. With a number of classic stories and having managed to fully express the potential of the Avengers that I think Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did a solid job of just setting up, this is a pretty critical part of the team's history. I gave it a slightly lower grade than Stan Lee's era because those comics are pretty great start to finish, with few limitations. And I find they still exist above and beyond what most other eras of Avengers comics ever managed to achieve. The Thomas Buschema era, in comparison, was also very solid and very nearly as good. But it takes a little while for Roy Thomas and the Buschemas to reach their full potential. 10 or so issues, in fact, which is a lot considering how, in the future, Other writers and artists would be lucky to get that many issues at all. I also found, as I reached the end of this massive run, the stories did tend to dry up a little bit, creatively speaking. It's hard to fault Roy Thomas, but after 70 or so issues and 6 years of writing Avengers comics, it did feel like he lost a little bit of energy in his work on this series. By the time we got to the 100th issue, I found the writing a little underwhelming. And it sets a very unfortunate trend when it comes to the 100-issue milestone books in the first volume of the Avengers. Overall, there are better Avengers comics out there than those written by Roy Thomas, but they are very, very rare. Be sure to subscribe to Comic Island for more videos about comics, new and old. It's a funny thing revisiting some of these books and how memory can distort things. I really didn't like these books as an adult reading them for this series, but they were very popular with myself when I was younger and the comic book audience of the time. By those metrics, one could argue Englehart's Avengers were pretty strong overall. It succeeded at selling a brand to the audience at the time, so who am I to fault it? I ask this because here I am, about to fault these books quite a bit. Because what worked as a kid didn't necessarily work for me now that I can look at these books, especially with a longer scale of Avengers comics. By having been able to have read through Thomas's era, I can better appreciate his Avengers books and what had already been done so far. By being able to look at all the books at once instead of whatever happened to have been available to me as a much younger person, I have a better appreciation for the series as a whole, and it's changed my perspective on things. It seems like Englehart really tried to imitate Roy Thomas's level of storytelling and sophistication without having the needed skills. He maintained that level of character drama and development, but he cranked that drama up a lot, while hollowing out the character development quite a bit. Suddenly, the Avengers characters resembled ones that existed in a soap opera. Meanwhile, the complex adventures Thomas had put the Avengers up against gave Waid a far simpler takes on villains and a more traditional look at superheroes fighting villains. While that's not necessarily bad, where I defined the Lee and Thomas eras of Avengers that had happened so far as being ahead of their time and relatively above the quality other books had in those years, Steve Englehart felt like he had fallen behind the Bronze Age of comic books, with DC rapidly catching up with Marvel's innovations and even surpassing them with new content that defied what could be expected out of superhero books. Englehart felt like he was making very traditional decisions regarding the Avengers. I don't want to come across as too negative here. These books aren't terrible. This was the last era where Stan Lee seemed to still have some creative input into the Avengers, at least as far as I can tell. But Roy Thomas also stuck around, now working as the book's main editor. So we occasionally get stories that pushed against what one might expect out of a typical superhero affair. Like one really cool book that stood out and felt like it was straight out of the Roy Thomas era featuring Black Panther. That issue was all about T'Challa dealing with his role as the ruler of a foreign country that felt pretty ahead of its time. All that stuff generally gets forgotten or ignored in the light of the big name story Englehart is best remembered for, the Avengers-Defenders clash. This big event that crossed over both series and showed off all kinds of fun you could expect in the shared Marvel universe. It was very popular at the time. When Steve Englehart came up with the idea, Roy Thomas said that Englehart would have to be careful to make sure these books all came out in the correct order on time. Something that couldn't just be taken for granted at the time, but Englehart managed to pull it off without a delay. However, I find myself barely getting through this story. Maybe crossovers like this have come too far since then, and I just can't enjoy it for what it is. Maybe, unlike Avengers stories that had come before, this really doesn't work for anyone outside of maybe a young reader who is already a fan of both Avengers and Defenders. At this point, likely an extinct species, because any kid that's a fan of these two teams is likely a fan of a later iteration of them. But whatever the case, I get nothing out of the Avengers-Defenders clash. Not the story, not even art still featuring Sal Buschema working alongside Bob Brown and both doing a pretty decent job. The artwork in general from this era also seems to take a firm and unfortunate step backwards. In general, I found too many panels and pages that were just full of boring, static, 6 panels of people talking. And suddenly all the creative imagery that had populated the Avengers comics up until this point felt like it had dried up quite a bit. Looking over the many decades of Avengers comics, this is unfortunately one of the most dry in terms of artwork creativity, too often featuring those Avengers just chatting with each other, panel after panel. A big name in the history of Avengers comics, George Pérez, did join the series at some point during Englehart's run, but it did little to change my opinion of this era of Avengers when it comes to the artwork.
Because at a certain point, it doesn't matter how talented your artists are if they aren't given interesting things to draw.
Englehart did have his moments, such as introducing Mantis to the world, or having Beast join the team, a popular and fun choice. And he even explored plot ideas that were later followed up on in Marvel as recently as this year with the Empire event. It doesn't help that late into this era, we started getting big-name guest writers in the form of Tony Isabella and Jerry Conway. They did a good job, but largely served to highlight my existing issues with the larger era being otherwise completely tethered to Steve Englehart. A handful of fun comics, or even vaguely important moments, across over 50 issues, is hardly worth anyone's time. And here we have our first low grade, but to be fair, it's not the lowest grade. That may seem like I'm damning the Englehart era with faint praise, but it really does mean something. As much as I didn't get a lot out of his take on the Avengers, I didn't feel like it was actively antagonistic or even unbearably boring. No, when it comes to Avengers books, you could do a lot worse. The problem is, sadly for this era at least, you can also do a lot better. If you want classic Avengers comics, you are way better off exploring the dozens and dozens of books written by Roy Thomas or Stan Lee. If you want more weird stuff focusing on offbeat characters like Mantis, well, there are better Avengers runs with those kind of tastes too. And even in the world of crossover stuff and big broad action, there are plenty of examples in the modern era of that done better than here. That might be the biggest problem with these books. I'm not sure what role they can fill today. I have a hard time believing kids would like these comics much anymore. I feel adults would struggle to stay entertained or appreciate the history behind these books at this point, because there isn't all that much of either. Still, there is something to be said for these books and their charm, along with their commitment to weirdness. I haven't talked about it yet much because it wasn't written all that great here, but Vision and Scarlet Witch relationship was a good part of the Avengers, and even to a degree here. I mean, it reflects the melodrama I was talking about earlier, but it also reflects how these books weren't really afraid of exploring new territory, even if that territory was potentially controversial or some sort of off-putting romance. With the way American fiction tends to view and treat artificial life, Vision and Wanda represents an early, and still relatively lonely, healthy relationship between android and human, and one that in the world of fiction feels like the rest of the media is only now just kind of coming around to. The Avengers had been in an interesting place after Steve Englehart had left the series. Though personally I didn't enjoy the era, whatever I feel of it, the Avengers at the time were never more popular. But in the mid-1970s, things at Marvel were in a bit of position of flux. A new editor and writer named Jim Shooter was coming to increase prominence within the company. Eventually securing the position of editor-in-chief at Marvel, Jim Shooter also wrote dozens of issues of Avengers along the way. Unfortunately, just about everyone, myself included, have a lot of problems with at least some of the books Shooter specifically wrote. While a lot can be said about Jim Shooter as an editor, less so can be said of his Avengers comics. His time with this series is also a bit unique in that he sort of came, went, and returned to the series, with other writers filling in many gaps along the way. As such, I sort of divided up this era into two parts, the first consisting of a run roughly between 161 to 171, along with the books written from issue 200 to 230, those largely being books written by Jim Shooter, while the second part will talk about books not written by Jim Shooter, published in between Jim Shooter's take on the Avengers series. We'll talk about that second part a little later, and it is confusing but worth doing, because while I understand what the writers were going for in the in-between time period, I have no idea what Jim Shooter was up to for these comics. The most infamous comic that man ever wrote, indeed one of the most infamous single issues of a comic book ever written in Western history, has to be Avengers number 200. I've talked a bit about what is wrong with the book before, but it's pretty self-evident just by going over the plot. Carol Danvers, then Miss Marvel, and a pretty new character at that, was unwillingly impregnated by a cosmic being who she gave birth to. That baby, named Marcus I believe, grew to an adult, assaulted her mind, and forced her into falling in love with them. The two then left for space, the Avengers seemingly oblivious to the disturbing events and happy for their friend entering into an incestuous relationship against her will. It's a gross book written by somebody who simply does not appreciate the disgustingness of his own behavior, and likely has never reconciled with it since. To do this for the big landmark issue, like the 200th Avengers book, simply adds insult to injury. This book has become widely and rightfully ridiculed, while at the time, the co-creator of Miss Marvel, Chris Claremont, was so outraged at the story he later wrote a book where Carol returned, berated the Avengers, and Jim Shooter by proxy, for letting her get used like that, and stayed under the safe custody of the X-Men for a little while. It also began a very, very unfortunate tradition when it came to Avengers writers treating Carol Danvers' character terribly. So it is with all this baggage I found myself returning to the Jim Shooter era, but to be fair, I knew little else of his other Avengers books. Jim's story arcs The Bride of Ultron, the Nefaria trilogy, and the Korvac saga were well received as fun bits of action at the time they were released, so maybe there would be something to enjoy beyond the worst Avengers book ever written. I wasn't about to ignore Avengers 200, but I sure was willing to look past it and judge the larger body of work Jim Shooter contributed to Avengers as a whole, if the rest of his work was meaningfully different from one terrible comic. After all, it should be noted that Jim Shooter also wrote the 1984 Secret Wars, a fan favorite story and one I quite enjoyed too. He also did a lot for comic book writers and artists behind the scenes, and from what I understand deserves a lot of credit for securing certain financial guarantees that he still enjoys to this day. Sadly, I don't like any of his other Avengers books. They all feature villains that by then were already very familiar foes to the team. The well-regarded action simply doesn't hold up that well over time, and there isn't much other reason to enjoy these stories. The artwork feels pretty listless and not very exciting, especially compared to the first 100 issues or so of the series, even though a lot of big names like Buschema and George Pérez, artists from that time period, were still around. While I applaud the ambition of the Korvac saga, which featured every Avenger to have ever been on the team up until that point in the story, it, like others, is disorganized and frantic thanks to Jim Shooter, and so the fun of what that moment should be doesn't really feel like it gets lived up to. It should be a bigger deal to have all these Avengers and former Avengers working together to fight this villain, but Jim Shooter really has trouble putting together a coherent sense of a story in these Avengers comics. And worst of all, it becomes pretty clear to me, reading through these Avengers books, that Jim Shooter's writing in Avengers number 200 wasn't some one-off problem or weird fluke, but rather it's part of a pretty consistent and rather disturbing pattern that I think we should talk about a little bit. The thing is, up until now, we haven't really had to talk about how female characters were written in the Avengers because there was no need to distinguish them from how Stan Lee, Roy Thomas, and even Steve Englehart wrote men. In the early days of the Avengers, Scarlet Witch, Wasp, and Black Widow were all pretty well written and felt quite progressive as a whole. Yes, Wasp was and is a fashion designer and has this big interest in fashion, which I guess someone could argue is a very stereotypical girl thing in a team of scientists, military men, and gods especially, but that was always kind of part of her personality and history. It also went a long way to explaining how the Avengers were always wearing colorful costumes that would occasionally change design, especially on Wasp's part. While it should be noted that Wasp's main female teammate, the Scarlet Witch, from the beginning was written as a former terrorist. The message was loud and clear from these early Avengers books. Women could be just about anything, good or bad. Even as Steve Englehart played up the relationship between Scarlet Witch and Vision, Wanda was still a person with her own agency and interests beyond the robot. I mean, Englehart did start writing her in a way that suddenly made her a lot more emotional than she ever was before, willing to shed a tear at a moment's notice as the whole series was morphing into a soap opera. But the main characters were acting just as moody at the time, with Hawkeye outright throwing a temper tantrum at one point. Flash forward to the Jim Shooter era, and suddenly things have changed. It's subtle at first. Jim's books introduce a sense of sexuality to the Avengers. That's good in general, as it makes the team more human-like, and less a set of larger-than-life vague archetypes that better define the character work in the team's early days. And look, I like those early days, but they are very static in terms of their character work. The problem is that at the time, this sexuality was slanted so heavily towards women. That's actually unique to the Jim Shooter era in the history of Avengers, by the way. While many Avengers comics following Jim Shooter's time with the series would very much play up sexual tension and sexuality in general, they always did so to men and women alike. And while I'm not saying that it has to be done to both genders equally, deeper than that is the loss of agency. Our female characters suddenly found themselves driving stories less than their male counterparts and being affected by events more. Carol's pregnancy is a good example of that in action, but this absolutely includes Wasp, who is relegated to reacting to her increasingly volatile and bizarre husband, which Jim Shooter started to focus on over time. And don't worry, I'm not done talking about that yet. The whole thing is so cartoonishly over the top, it almost feels like self-parody. Even much later on in 1984, when Jim Shooter wrote Secret Wars, I like that story, but it too has some pretty problematic elements when it comes to how its female characters were written. On its own, it's fine, although I will point out it's something I noticed and commented on when we originally reviewed that story years ago. But looking over these Avengers books along with Secret Wars, collectively it paints a picture of a man who didn't necessarily hate women, but at best was completely unable to write them. In my opinion, it's far more likely that things are worse than the best case scenario, though. You don't write this way for this many different characters over so many different stories without there being some sort of underlying psychology or pattern to it. There has to be an explanation because the evidence is overwhelming. This all compounds in one final nail in the coffin. After a terrible run of books, late into Jim's run writing Avengers comics, he started to really play around with Hank Pym suffering some sort of mental breakdown. This whole storyline was so dragged out and so confusing and went so far back and forth that on its own, it's a complete disaster. Hank Pym becomes the Yellow Jacket, then gets co-opted by a villain, but then recovers, then he gets a breakdown again and turns onto the team, only for him to outright hit his wife as she tries to stop them in an act of clear-cut domestic abuse. Except, Jim Shooter kind of disputed that assault and claimed that it wasn't supposed to be written that way, and might have been an accident on the part of penciler Bob Hall interpreting a vague script from Jim Shooter. So we had this major cataclysmic change to Hank Pym's character that forever changed what fans thought of him, and apparently it was all done by accident. Regardless of whether or not this was an intentional move on behalf of Shooter, Hall, or Marvel, fans were appalled by Hank's behavior, with many having never forgiven him, not even in the present day, almost 40 years later. The long and bitter feelings were compounded by the fact that Hank Pym, within the context of the story, should never be fully trusted again by the Avengers without them looking like idiots. I don't really defend Marvel through any of this, although I will point out that exploring domestic violence with a character that isn't evil is a very interesting idea that can get into concepts of forgiveness, redemption, complex questions that very much feel relevant to today. Let's not pretend that was the intention of the book or the plan for Hank Pym's character at the time. So the Avengers series at the time in this story is not at all set up to deal with this very serious topic. It was an accident after all. I can't stress that point enough because it goes far in explaining not only the tone and tenor of the story at the time, but also how incompetent this era of Avengers comics truly was. What an insane time for Avengers comics. Two different characters were damaged and in some ways forever stained by two different stories widely considered some of the worst in Marvel's history. every female member of the team was suddenly turned into a pinup model that had their brains scooped out. And for the big, celebratory 200th issue of the Avengers, we got the worst thing ever made. What other grade could this era of Avengers possibly deserve? Perhaps the saddest part in all of this is that it affected the larger grading scheme of the Avengers and how I view the series as a whole. And the reason for that is very simple. Every time I came across another bad or boring era that would be published later on in this series' history, all I had to do was ask myself, did anyone give birth to a space abomination that tried to breed with their parent? And since the answer was always no, the fact of the matter is nothing may well ever be as bad as the Jim Shooter era of Avengers. And I take some comfort in that to a degree. The Avengers have hit rock bottom a long time ago, over a decade before I was even born. There's something nice in knowing it's almost impossible for the books to ever get as bad as they were at this time. As mentioned, the Jim Shooter era I did not find particularly good, but I also found it quite confusing. As the man rose up in prominence at Marvel, Jim Shooter kind of came and went from the Avengers series in a way no other writer in the history of the Avengers ever did. Because of that, other writers, including the likes of big names such as Tom DeFalco and Marv Wolfman, would occasionally fill in. Well, most of what I'm referring to there are individual issues featuring guest writers. One man, David Michelinie, wrote a slew of Avengers books pretty much in between Jim Shooter's run. And I wanted to take a bit of time and talk about the Avengers books not written by Shooter from this time period, because they're just so distinct and different. They feel worth talking about and grading separately, though it should be noted that it is very clear as Shooter gained power over the Avengers series and Marvel itself, his vision of the Avengers team increasingly took hold, even beyond Avengers books that weren't exactly written by him. Editors have a lot of power, and Jim Shooter was famous for wielding it, driving many talented people away from the company with this behavior in the years to come. The shame of it all is that there is a very different version of the Avengers floated around by David Michelinie before Jim Shooter had fully taken control. And yes, this video is coming down just as hard, if not harder, on Jim Shooter than the previous round all about him, but what can I say? He's the villain of this story. Starting around issue 181 and continuing until things go south in the late 190s, Michelinie shows a version of the Avengers unlike anything we've ever seen before or since. It really comes down to book number 181. In it, we're introduced to some new ideas that, to Shooter's credit, had been slowly percolating during his initial run with the series. The government is threatening to revoke privileges the Avengers enjoy as part of America's perennial superhero team. So they are assigned Henry Peter Gyrich in order to restructure the team and comply with certain government standards. In response to the by then bloated roster of Avengers floating on and off the team, things are trimmed down to just 7 members. 6 established characters joined by newcomer Falcon. Installed on the team as an overt move of affirmative action on the part of the government, while many other long-standing members were suddenly, and without ceremony or anything, just dismissed. The dynamics here I find really interesting. This is by far the most an external body managed to restrict and control any iteration of Avengers to date. I really would have liked to see that idea explored more than unfortunately it really was around this time period, as it has a lot of potential to it. Adding to that was Michelinie's strong ability to zero in on character dynamics, leading to a fun sense of an active team worth following issue by issue. Falcon joining the superhero team was particularly notable because he was very much aware and annoyed by the fact that this was done solely because he was black. Yet he joins the team just the same because Captain America is his friend and Sam Wilson, more than anything else, is a good partner. Meanwhile, Michelinie really brings the series back in a way I feel it had been dormant ever since the days of Roy Thomas almost 100 issues before. Roy Thomas, by the way, wound up being one of Jim Shooter's many casualties as he took over as editor-in-chief at Marvel. Michelinie immediately sets out to take us on a fun, worthwhile series of stories, even exploring Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver's origin in a fun way that ultimately led to those two characters' histories being practically indecipherable. The man took full advantage of talented artists like John Byrne and Sal Buschema, by then established Avengers creators who I feel languished under Jim Shooter, and right away you can see them sort of return to life with Michelinie's writing. in a way I really feel is absent from the Shooter books, even though we're talking about the exact same artists. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter how good those artists are if they're drawing a poorly thought out or uncreative story, which was Jim Shooter's problem for vast swaths of his time with the Avengers. He never had untalented artists, but he wrote very poor scripts. Michelinie and the other writers, on the other hand, tell us these fun and vivid stories where the artists flourish, and the stories suddenly feel a lot more like Avengers books. This goes beyond Michelinie and definitely includes the likes of virtually every other guest writer around this time period. Their stories feature stuff like villains being colorful, creative, and unpredictable, while the Avengers are full of personality and quickly dive in and face the problems at hand. Michelinie found a fun combination of characters, new and old, to fill out the roster, added a whole bunch of interesting political dynamics, and it's always fun to see Hawkeye get hilariously rejected from the team and throw an absolute fit over it. The shame of it all is it ultimately doesn't go anywhere, and this fun dynamic really feels like the eye in the middle of Hurricane Jim. A brief moment of peace before everything in the Avengers series went horribly wrong. You could see as Jim Shooter gains power in the company, David Michelinie's ideas take more and more of a spot in the back seat. Almost right away, the Avengers escape from government oversight. And though it's a cathartic moment to see Captain America reassert control over the team after Gyrich was being so antagonistic, the promise of exploring the cool idea of a government really controlling the Avengers is abandoned far too quickly in the process. The new, more focused roster also gets quickly abandoned. This is what I mean when I say Jim Shooter was having an effect on Michelinie's version of the Avengers, because over time, they start to resemble Shooter's ideas more and more, which leads to a visible dip in quality, even from the books not specifically written by Jim Shooter. The thing I find most frustrating is when Michelinie seemed to have the most control over the Avengers. He was writing something that reminded me a lot of acclaimed series Justice League International. Both runs involved radically changing the existing team, making things more grounded and character-focused, all the while taking on a certain quirky flair to it. But I bring up Justice League International for a very specific reason. That was produced at the end of the 1980s and was quite influential in how superhero team stories were told from then on out. Michelinie's run largely takes place in the late 70s and early 80s, meaning that Marvel could have preempted the series by nearly a full decade if they had gone in this direction. That could have really changed the history of both Justice League and the Avengers at both Marvel and DC, in a way that could have very well been for the better. Sadly, instead we got Avengers number 200. Remembering that this grading system is tailored to only compare Avengers comics against each other, I place Michelinie's books just below average. At its best, it is spectacular. At its worst, it gets completely derailed as the series charged straight into its all-time low points. There's some cool ideas, phenomenal artwork, and exciting moments, but sadly none of it lasts very long. Though Michelinie wrote many Avengers comics, either around or even with Jim Shooter, it's clear that the more Jim Shooter was involved, the worse David's books got, and the more his ideas were being washed out. As such, even though David wrote at least 25 or so Avengers books, I'd say about only half of those are really worth reading. If I haven't made it abundantly clear by now, I don't rest a lot of blame on David Michelinie for this era of Avengers comics and the problems it suffered. I could be wrong, and I see people disagreeing or having their own interpretation of events. I'm really just going by comments people have made years later and what I can get out of the books themselves. But to me, this is how I've come to view the Avengers around this time period as they moved into the 1980s. Furthering this is that Michelinie would return to the Avengers on occasion as a guest writer in the future, and always did a good job. I believe the man had all the great signs of a writer who had the potential to truly reimagine the Avengers into something we still haven't really seen to this day, and never really got a chance to do so to begin with. I might go so far as to argue the biggest tragedy in the entire history of the Avengers publication run was that Jim Shooter for a long time defined the team's history, while David Michelinie, sadly, does not. Just the same, we are grading the final product, not the potential of these comics. Like it or not, it should be recognized that Avengers history simply wouldn't be the same without the missteps, and there's really no changing that. If I were to be able to wave a magic wand and wipe away the Jim Shooter era, well, we very well could wipe away the MCU in the process, or so much more. You never really know. So setting aside hypotheticals, we are looking entirely at the raw quality of the David Michelinie Avengers comics. And while they're a fun read for the curious or those who want to see a little bit of Avengers editorial history for themselves, and judge whether or not I correctly interpreted the situation, in the world of Avengers otherwise, you could do a lot better, since a lot of the cool parts of this era didn't last very long and are hardly explored here. A C grade should reflect this sort of middling opinion I have of this particular run of Avengers books. It has some strong moments of storytelling quality, but it never really came together into a proper run of Avengers titles fully worth your time. It is far better than anything Jim Shooter did, and that's why we definitely were going to talk about it separately from him. And I would argue it is even better than Steve Englehart's take on the Avengers from before Jim Shooter. But compared to the core history of the Avengers in the first 150 issues, or a bunch of comics we haven't talked about yet, David Michelinie's Avengers, unfortunately, comes up a little short. But then again, things in the history of the Avengers books have been so much worse. We'll talk about whether or not that's the case in the 1980s as we get a new writer named Roger Stern. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics. The Avengers were in a rough spot in the early 1980s. This isn't me hand-wringing retroactively over bad comics from the far future. Jim Shooter's run up until issue 220 or so was widely controversial at the time it came out. Whatever popularity the team and series might have once enjoyed was gone, and suddenly a major tentpole in Marvel's roster of comics was vulnerable to losing its fanbase, all the while being mocked and derided by writers elsewhere in the industry, even within Marvel. Following Jim Shooter's time with the Avengers, writers like David Michelinie and Stephen Grant would fill in for a handful of issues. It felt like the series took a moment to take stock of itself, focusing a bit on new members She-Hulk and Tigra, while a new writer was sought out behind the scenes. Change was desperately needed, that much was clear, and the folks at Marvel sought out a writer who could offer a new start and direction to pull the series out of controversy that had plagued it since the 200th issue and the ongoing issues surrounding Hank Pym's character. That job ultimately went to Roger Stern. Stern is a bit different than a lot of the writers we've talked about so far. While most of them were relatively new and cut their teeth on the Avengers line early in their careers as comic book writers, with the exception of Stan Lee. At the time he took over the Avengers in the early 1980s, he had already been active since 1975, had been writing for a major Marvel character in the form of Spider-Man, and even worked as an editor for the Avengers series earlier. Right around the time he was creating the villain Hobgoblin, Stern was asked to take on the Avengers series. And luckily for the Avengers, he accepted the offer. I have to say, I was very relieved to find after over 100 issues of comics I just found so middling, or much worse. Roger Stern's Avengers is a breath of fresh air. These books hold up well, and right out of the gate, we need to talk about how great these comics look, with Stern largely working with John Buschema for the majority of his lengthy run. With Buschema's artwork and some excellent inking, we really get a sense of atmosphere and pacing that is absent in a lot of the older Avengers comics. Stern has a massively successful and long run and is responsible for the vast majority of Avengers comics that came out in the 1980s, starting at 227 and running all the way up to 287. In addition to the new members added to the team, Stern added one of his own characters and creations, Monica Rambeau, the then Captain Marvel, as a permanent fixture of the new team. Meanwhile, Star Fox, brother of Thanos, joined for a while and later was shuffled out for the likes of Namor and Dr. Druid. With so many issues and new characters written by Roger Stern, he covers a great deal of ground, a huge range of different stories and even different kinds of stories, and a big shift in his focus on these new characters. But we kept some of the old guard, and Wasp shifted to a new but well-deserved leadership role. Black Knight and Hercules, who had been around the Avengers series for some time, now took center stage. Aiding this massive shift in the roster was the creation of a new team created by Roger Stern called the West Coast Avengers. Collectively, the Avengers were built up in a way they hadn't been before. By having two teams, Stern could allow the Avengers series to focus on some newer and lesser developed characters, while mainstays took on a life of their own elsewhere. Thus, Stern was able to make the likes of the new Captain Marvel, She-Hulk, Hercules, and Wasp be the main focus throughout his run, leading to basically all these other characters becoming iconic members of the team with a huge legacy still warmly regarded by fans to this day. It was a cool and remarkably progressive shift for the Avengers, especially given that this is all taking place over the 80s, but one that Roger Stern not only enthusiastically embraced, but didn't ever really pat himself on the back within the context of his own stories. He just sort of put Wasp in charge and let a huge amount of focus shift towards Monica Rambeau as the resident newcomer superhero, and didn't really spend a lot of time congratulating himself for it. He just sort of kept writing Avengers stories, and that's the way to do it. It's really wonderful, and in hindsight is the best take on making the Avengers more progressive in the entire history of this team. It definitely helps that both of these women were very well written by Roger Stern, which is great because as the years went on, Monica would kind of grow into her role as an Avenger and ultimately be elected the new chairwoman of the team following Wasp's time in the role. Speaking of, Stern also did a borderline heroic job of basically salvaging the confusing mess that was the remnants of Hank Pym and Wasp's characters following the Jim Shooter era. While Roger Stern doesn't fix everything, nor does he magically make that dark time somehow go away, he walks back enough it certainly reduces the blunt blow of those terrible stories, at least somewhat holding Hank Pym accountable, vastly increasing Janet's legacy as she takes on more and more of a leadership role in the team. That stuff probably did a lot long-term in saving Hank Pym's character from being discarded entirely once Scott Lang finally came along years later. In general, I like the way Stern focuses on fun character work so much that it really doesn't matter what stories and what villains or threat these characters are facing. It's just fun watching this team going about solving any problem and hanging out at their headquarters. But the good news is most of the actual Avengers stories and the threats they face around this time are also pretty well put together. The stories are fun too. You get stuff like Zeus or Vision taking over all computers on a planet in a well-meaning attempt to force world peace. A bunch of Marvel robots might team up to take on the Avengers, or maybe Spider-Man will show up for the story and once again try to join the team. You could really get anything from the Avengers at this time period, and I found the comics from this era were wonderfully unpredictable because of this. Stern also created a new home for the Avengers, a fun part of the team's history known as the Hydro Base, and it gave this era a distinct flair after the team had spent so much time in the Avengers Mansion after over 250 issues. Yet for all these changes to the roster, their home, and even the artwork, the general identity of the Avengers always remained the same. At the core of Roger Stern's run is two overriding elements, weirdness and stewardship. His books are weird, and that keeps them true to the core nature of pretty much every Avengers comic up until that point. So we do have a vastly different team than anything that had ever come before, yet it feels very distinctly of the Avengers aesthetic that by this point had been well established. And when I say weird, I do mean this in the best way possible. Stern's Avengers embraces every corner of Marvel, packing itself full of aliens, gods, and monsters from throughout Marvel's history, new and old. And that makes it very connected to not only the Avengers series that had come before it, but Marvel's by then well-explored and established shared universe. And yes, that does lead to moments of goofiness or campy silliness that does stand out relative to what was being published around this time in the 1980s throughout the industry. But it comes with a strong sense of sincerity. We really hadn't seen this series since Steve Englehart. If you go back and look at that review, I said the weirdness of Englehart's era was its best trait, and Roger Stern really brings that sense of weirdness back. But also really a strong sense of quality control that I feel Englehart and obviously Jim Shooter didn't carry. That gets into another second fundamental principle in Roger Stern's Avengers, stewardship. Stern can be seen as a sort of overseer of the Avengers at a time when Marvel Comics was fraught with change, and not always for the better. While the series was hardly resistant to the changes and cultural sensibilities of the 1980s, Roger Stern didn't let the Avengers become flush with the designs and sensibilities of the day. Instead, most of the characters take on a more timeless look, which helps them and makes these comics feel a lot less dated than they could be. Likewise, Stern didn't let the climate of the comics become darker and grittier, or spoil the more lighthearted fun of the Avengers' earlier days. These aspects of his writing I just described are what I like most about Roger Stern as an Avengers writer. He kept the series fun and fresh at a time when many comics were going in a darker direction that I don't think would have serviced these books. And he didn't do that easily either. This created conflict with various higher-ups at Marvel to the extent, after years of writing for the series, having essentially pulled the team from the brink and made them bigger and more successful than they ever were before. Roger Stern was suddenly and unceremoniously dropped by editor Mark Gruenwald. With all the nice things I've had to say about his run with the Avengers, this high grade shouldn't be a huge surprise to anyone. Yet another era falls just short of an elusive A+ that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby earned in their initial run. There are a couple of reasons for this. First, while I like most of the characters on Stern's Avengers, if there's a weak link, it's this guy, Star Fox. The whole idea of him being Thanos' brother, and otherwise being a bit of an outsider to the rest of the Avengers, does work in his favor. But in the history of new characters joining the Avengers, he ranks among the worst. So I don't like him very much in the Avengers, but he does have some fun moments in the series, like when Thanos shows up and teams up with the Avengers during the Secret Wars 2 event. That's an interesting change too, as increasingly these tie-ins would become a part of the Avengers series. In the case of Stern's era, it generally works in his favor, but it's also the reason he gets not an A+. And also serves as a bad omen for Marvel's increased dependency on these types of events. This is where that sort of thing starts, and it doesn't slow down in the future. In this era, the tie-ins to the Avengers are pretty fun, for now, but that won't always be the case. Still, that story isn't amazing, but it's strong enough that in another weaker era of Avengers, it would actually have boosted its grade. Instead, it holds back Roger Stern's Avengers. That to me is not really a big statement of any weakness, but rather a statement of the tremendous strength of the overall run by Roger Stern. His Avengers were far from perfect, but the flaws that are there are very minimal, while it has so many cool strengths working in its favor. If you're looking for some solid Avengers books to check out, these issues come highly recommended by me, with few others ranking above them. With Roger Stern having been forcibly removed from Avengers history, the writing job shifted to Walt Simonson after a brief stint by Ralph Macchio. Not that one. A strange thing about this is that such a move could naturally induce a pretty substantial change in the series. Obviously, if editor Mark Gruenwald wasn't happy with the Avengers series as it existed, getting a new writer would be a good way to change things. And yet our roster remains largely the same as before, even with the general tone and lax nature of the series remaining more or less intact. I'm not sure if those early books were already in production or if they felt the need to slowly introduce Simonson's own team, but either way, half of his run is very similar to Roger Stern's. There was conflict from the beginning. In the years to come, Walt has since described the scripts that he'd spent months working on for the Avengers series being eviscerated by people like Gruenwald and other superiors within the company. It occasionally shows in the writing itself, with Simonson's first arc feeling particularly dry, especially compared to the Stern comics from before. Things started to feel a little unfocused at times. Unfortunately, you can see a lot of quality there too, but there are forces clearly holding it back, and I don't think that has a lot to do with Walt Simonson, who's a talented writer with a long history of writing successful comic books. It in fact shows at times. Introduced on the team in the late Stern days, I really liked Dr. Druid as an Avenger. I've talked before about how progressive the Avengers felt around this time, and honestly, a slightly overweight guy who's a little older feels like an absolute rarity in the world of superheroes. And I'm not saying that as someone looking back on something in the late 80s, I'm saying that as someone in the 2020, talking about the present day. Dr. Druid, though he was never really warmly regarded as a character throughout critic history, in the Avengers consistently feels like a welcome addition to the team, and a character utterly unique to the team's history and, to be honest, most superheroes. Marvel, DC, and even their larger film studio parent companies love to pat themselves on the back over diversity and progressive stuff, but no matter how you cut it across the entire history of these companies, we really haven't seen superheroes that look like this before. In spite of all the conflict going on behind the scenes and a somewhat dry first arc, there's a lot of fun potential in Walt Simonson's era that never really gets fully realized. He works amazingly well with John Buschema. Though their time on the Avengers was short and their scripts apparently gutted to some extent, the two pull off some very memorable and delightful moments. There's a great story with a legion of alternate Kang the Conquerors all scheming for power, that opens with a full-out Robot Dinosaur Rampage, for crying out loud. It's great! Walt even created a story using some of his characters created elsewhere named Nanny and Orphan Maker, two current stars of the ongoing series in the present day Hellions, which was just fun for me to see. Another issue has Jarvis straight up battling a giant robot. In both of those stories, Walt also introduced to the Avengers series a Captain America that had been redesigned from that role, and was at the time just calling himself the Captain. Yet his stories remain fun and character-focused and don't feel gimmicky around this new costume for Steve Rogers. The Captain is also featured heavily in the sole annual Walt wrote for this series, a fun book that showed he was more than capable of having former Avengers show up for stories that could be written effectively. That annual features the likes of Avengers from all corners of the team's history, including Beast, the Hulk, and Jocasta, a character whose name I have probably mispronounced, because I haven't talked about her yet and forgot to research it before recording this, but is a fun part of Avengers history and their consistent open-mindedness when it comes to synthetic life, something I've talked about already when it comes to Vision and his relationship with Scarlet Witch. That annual is sort of a big celebratory thing that absolutely would have been the excellent sort of story for the big issue Walt Simonson also wrote, number 300. But instead of it being some sort of big celebration, issue number 300 is the second part of the tie-in to the event Inferno, a move that I can't help but suspect Marvel was responsible for. I did say that Roger Stern's era marked the beginning of tie-ins, and already it's starting to escalate, and the Avengers found themselves not only barreling towards the modern age of crossover events and tie-ins, often interrupting the series to its own detriment, but also it maintained their bizarre tradition of underwhelming, if not bad, 100-issue anniversary specials. It's a pretty disappointing end to Walt Simonson's run, but given all the conflict going on behind the scenes, I will say this. I don't put a lot of this era's fault on him. Like David Michelinie, Walt Simonson would return as a guest writer for the Avengers in the future and would do a good job, indicating to me that both writers and the problems they suffered with during their main run with the Avengers were in many ways editorial. And these larger problems that affect the Avengers series and a lot of other Marvel history, largely as the result of a terrible corporate culture, extend far beyond Jim Shooter, who at this point no longer had that sort of power within the company. In spite of it all, the stories written around this time have a lot of focus on the characters they feature, which serves them well. Walt is a good writer in this respect, had a clear vision for the Avengers even if he didn't get a chance to actually explore it, and always left me wishing he had a chance to do more with the team. Like David Michelinie, I leave this era of Avengers wondering, more than anything else, about what could have been. Whatever was intended for this era of Avengers was not fully realized here, and we're left with a run of comics that feel incomplete, yet still have something to offer. 7 rounds in, and we're finding ourselves hitting our very first B grade of any kind, which is surprising because there's a lot more of it coming. But in this grading scheme I've created exclusively for Avengers comics, it should be noted, a B- indicates comics just above average. Not quite in the range of being one of my favorites, but not nearly in terrible land either. This run of Avengers comics is strong and has a lot of solid moments, yet there are problems, including the first story arc being quite long and unnecessarily drawn out, while issue number 300 is disappointing, as I said. Simonson's run is entertaining more than anything else though, hence the B grade. But I don't love that it distances itself heavily from the traditions up until then of relatively shorter Avengers stories, with the majority of stories up until now only being 1 or 2 issues long. Stern started the trend of having longer stories, but his time with the Avengers was long and could afford these long diversions into a random tale because he had a lot of single issues to back that up. Walt's is the shortest run a writer had with the Avengers up until this point. It has some outstanding stuff when it comes to character work, but it falls a little short in fully exploring some of these ideas because in part it takes too long to really get into things where writers like Roger Stern, Stan Lee, and Roy Thomas could have accomplished and did accomplish a lot more in 10 issues than Walt Simonson ever did. I do wish he had more time with this run just the same, because as it stands it really only feels half realized. By the time he was done with the series, he only really just got what was clearly going to be his team rolling. And there is quite a bit of value to that team, and it does seem to have some potential. Overall, it does stick out a great deal compared to some of the other lesser runs in Avengers history. The whole era feels like it robustly exists within the Marvel Universe, for example, and it is always fun to have cool characters we don't often get to see enjoy some real time in the spotlight. Even the Inferno tie-in has the fun of Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman joining the Avengers, as part of what was clearly going to be a new team consisting of them, the Captain, Thor, and the first Eternal to join the team, Gilgamesh. The new team seems cool, but we never really got to see them in action, though a version of them would basically exist as we go into the next age of Avengers. Still, some of my confusion in all this has to stem from the lack of communication at the time. It makes no sense to me that Marvel's editors would fire Roger Stern and then replace him with a writer who decided to basically just keep doing the same kind of stories, which was character-focused, goofy stories, and an offbeat team that really wasn't consisting of the most popular heroes at the time, but rather what worked best for the team. So either they should never have hired Simonson to begin with, if that's what he was going to do. They should have insisted from the beginning that he made sure things were more significantly different from the Roger Stern days, since that's why they fired Roger Stern. Or they should have compromised and not forced Simonson to make changes to scripts that had already been made. It's just bad management to have an incoming employee that you don't effectively communicate the changes that you want to the series, or they did communicate those changes to Walt Simonson and he just deliberately ignored them. We don't actually know, and there are two sides to every story, but whatever the case, it affects the final product when we look at these comics in a negative way. Part of the issue might have just been bloat. At this point, there was both an East and West Coast Avengers team also being published at the time, and maybe people at Marvel felt that sudden changes to the roster of these teams couldn't just arbitrarily be done. Some comics were made or right in the middle of production, and that might explain why it feels like it takes Walt Simonson's entire run just to get the team he wanted going. But that's on Marvel. They created this system, they created those rules, and made all those Avengers teams and weren't willing to budge on it. And either way, this is what we're left with. Books have been written on this sort of comic history, and that's largely where I'm drawing this information from, but they mostly just go by the words and recollections of Walt Simonson on the matter, years after the fact. Memory can be tricky and biased, even if someone didn't intend to distort the issue. And sometimes people very much do want to tell things that portray them in a favorable light. This feels especially true for someone like Walt Simonson, whose time with the Avengers represents a very small part of a long and storied career. How well do you remember a job that didn't work out so well 20 years ago, and how confident are you that you have the ability to present all the relevant facts and correctly remember all the relevant information if you were asked about it by someone today? So I'm not really calling him out when I say that his recollections might not be accurate. He has no means of verifying that information. We're all biased actors in this story. And I say that not to cast doubt on the official accounts of these events, just to remind everyone we should take stuff like this with a grain of salt. And that absolutely applies when we talk about the drama surrounding people like Roger Stern or Jim Shooter that has been discussed before already. Generally, this is why I prefer to grade and review what's actually in the comic itself. Unfortunately, when it comes to this particular era, I feel that the behind-the-scenes conflict is pretty present within the books, to the extent that it's the only way I can really make sense of it and put it into context. It's right there, and in and of itself, that's not a great sign. That sort of thing is what really takes me out of these Avengers comics. So, dissatisfied with everything we've just talked about, the second major Avengers writer in a row left the series under less than desirable circumstances. I'm not entirely sure whether Simonson was fired or quit. I don't really think it matters. But whatever the case, both parties went their separate ways, and both seem to have felt it would be for the best. One would think this would lead to some sort of contrition or reaction on Marvel's part, perhaps some sort of internal mandate to not let this happen again to one of Marvel's flagship series. Ralph Macchio, not that one, returned to the series to fill in for a time and explore the team Walt Simonson had just created, while a new writer would have to be found. And while it's clear this one was told at the outset that changes would be made, or he would need to get lost, this was far from the end of Avengers drama. The year was the late 1980s. Back then, in the folly of my youth, rather than reading Avengers comics, I was busy gestating in my mother's womb, though eventually I did grow out of that phase. Twice in a row now, in spite of some decent quality comics coming out of the series, Marvel editorial saw Avengers writers leave, and doing so under rocky circumstances, to put it politely. It does appear that the general climate in the company made things difficult to find a writer willing to stick around for the series, and fully explore a new take on the theme. Because even for the next few years after this, the series would continue to shift from one writer to the next. This appears to have initially happened because Marvel very clearly wanted the Avengers to look and feel different from the more light and lax tones set in the 80s. However, those dynamics did indeed change with the arrival of John Byrne, a legendary but complicated comic book artist who was chosen to helm Marvel's biggest team of superheroes as the new writer. The choice is interesting for a few reasons. One, if Marvel was looking for somebody to bring stability and a calming presence to the behind-the-scenes drama going on with the Avengers, they chose one of the worst people for that. Even John Byrne himself has admitted his behavior can be extremely abrasive, and he can be hard to work with. Though some have defended him, major comic book figures and former Avenger contributors Roy Thomas and Jack Kirby have had very legitimate professional issues with the man, while other professional figures have made it very clear they will never work with the dude again. This year alone in 2020 has found this particular issue resurface. Collectively, there's a lot of invisible baggage hanging around this particular review. Now, in general, when it comes to matters like this, I don't usually let the drama affect my review of the actual material at hand, unless the drama already did that. If Byrne is a terrible dude, but you wouldn't know it from his Avengers comics, well then we're probably going to give this era a high grade, regardless of what Byrne might have done outside of writing this series. After all, this is a group project. A lot of people other than Byrne worked on these Avengers books. On the other hand, if the drama somehow did affect the actual Avengers comics, well then suddenly it might make sense why I've been talking about John Byrne like this for so long now. Because that is going to affect my overall opinion and final grade quite a bit. It would have to. So far in grading the Avengers, we reviewed plenty of books that lean in both directions in the Avengers series at one point or another. So let's look at the Avengers comics Byrne wrote, independent of any preconceived notions I might have of the man. Because the choice to pick him as a writer is interesting in and of itself. For one thing, it gets into the fact that we are rapidly transitioning into the 90s with this era, where artists would increasingly take prominence. John Byrne is, after all, primarily known as an artist. He had penciled a number of Avengers comics long before he was ever chosen to write the series. And as we march closer into the 1990s, it makes sense that artists like him were starting to see new opportunities to write books like the Avengers. For those of you that don't know, this is the decade I would say out of all of comic history that most emphasized artists and increasingly had comics shifting towards them taking control over the storytelling. And while it's an excellent thing that comic book artists increasingly took credit for the creation of these comic books over time, I've found historically comic book artists taking on writing duties tend to be very inconsistent. I always think of that 10,000 hours needed to master something thing. Artists have spent that 10,000 hours doing so, but rarely have they also spent 10,000 hours writing, and usually wouldn't have seen these opportunities unless they had already been drawing comic books and had a foot in the door. If they were just going by their writing talent, I struggle to imagine most artists turned writers would ever have been hired as comic book writers. It goes the other way around too, but there are plenty of exceptions to that rule, and broadly speaking, John Byrne's time with the Avengers is a pretty strong example of where this stuff can work out well. He was paired with a penciler named Paul Ryan, not that one, and Tom Palmer, inking for the majority of his run on the Avengers book, while Byrne largely drew the West Coast series himself. And it does seem like through his past work and perspective as an artist, Byrne was able to bring out the best in the team from a visual point of view. His era starts out with one of my favorite spreads in the entire history of this series. Captain America summons just about every character to have ever called themselves an Avenger at this point, and announces that the team will be taking on a new dynamic to it. Both the main and West Coast team would be now headquartered in the Hydro base, allowing for more fluidity between the two teams. After all, Byrne was also doing the West Coast and even handling the art duties of that series at the time. But even though both teams would be kind of whittled down to a core membership, everyone present at this initial meeting would be welcome and potentially called upon for future missions. I assumed as the Avengers would be widowed down to a core 6 with a 7th spot left open for guests, that would be pretty much it for this awesome group shot we get at the beginning of this run, but no. In a move that really emphasizes Byrne's identity as an artist, just about every character shown in this group ends up doing something or another at some point in what wound up being a pretty short run with John Byrne. It's a very impressive use of not wasting visual space and instead using the artwork to orient your audience towards future content. Byrne knocks this kind of technical stuff out of the park. In general, this page is a pretty strong hint of what the first half of the run feels like. Not just in terms of what characters we're going to see, but just in terms of the big energy it has. In a story as simple as the Avengers battling lava men, the Hydro base gets launched into the sky in a staggering moment, and the rest of the adventure is filled with similar visually striking shenanigans. I was so impressed by the first arc that I was set to give this era an A. It felt exciting and full of classic adventures. The creativity was on a level I hadn't seen since the Jack Kirby days. And we were even getting some attention directed towards the Eternals, such as Gilgamesh remaining a core part of the team, while another Eternal named Circe also joined and would stay with the Avengers for the majority of the 90s.
Looking over the next decade, it seems Byrne was very influential in which characters were used, and the general tone that these comics would take in the years to come.
It took them 3 whole writers, but Marvel's editorial team had finally found and achieved the change in the Avengers they were apparently seeking around this time, and so desperately craved. Then the Avengers had their big tie-in event, again part of a larger ongoing trend for more and more crossover tie-ins. As I said in the Roger Stern days, the tie-ins can be fun, but in John Byrne's time, Acts of Vengeance is an example of where things can largely hold an era back. The story itself is okay in that it's a bit of a classic fun kind of superhero adventure where all the villains in the Marvel Universe hatch a big plan to fight superheroes they don't normally battle. It certainly has its moments, but it's just adequate and ultimately derails Byrne's run and kills the momentum he had going at a pretty key moment when he was just establishing his own Avengers story. I don't know if that's what informed what happened next, but I have a feeling the tie-in might have put Byrne off to a degree. Regardless of what actually happened, halfway through the next story arc, Byrne left the series entirely, flat out abandoning it mid-story. It was a move that in Avengers history is and largely remains unprecedented. Most other writers, even the ones dismissed, managed to transition out a lot more gently, because this story had the terrible effect on the overall quality of the story itself, but also my opinion of Byrne's time with the Avengers. Remember that Byrne's time with the series is relatively short, so this takes up a good chunk of it on the whole. Worse than that, it did irreparable damage to the era that would follow, weakening the overall efforts of the poor writer who had to replace John Byrne and try and figure out this story with what looks like very little information or help from Byrne himself. It wound up being a muddled mess involving the Avengers teaming up with Spider-Man, all on an adventure with Nebula somewhere in the depths of space. Sounds cool, but it's just so bafflingly bad. And so, as far as Byrne's run is concerned, what starts as one of the most promising runs in Avengers history, after only 13 issues, ends with one of the worst Avengers stories I've ever read. A B grade might seem generous for a relatively short run that obviously I feel kind of fell apart near the end. But John Byrne's era is an era of extremes. It had so many cool moments to it and is one of the best looking eras in all of Avengers history. But it is a relatively short run that didn't really go anywhere, badly damaged the final story arc and the Avengers comics to come after Byrne left the series, and also kind of walked back some of the more progressive moves as Byrne basically left Stern's team behind completely. But overall, the first half or so of John Byrne's time as writer for the series does a lot to make up for all of it too. I just really admire how much that first half is full of creativity and life, and certainly would recommend you check out at least that part for yourself. In spite of some mistakes made in the final moments of this era, Byrne, just like his predecessor, presented a clear vision of the Avengers that was bigger than ever, but also just that same sort of delightful, adventurous fun that made the series great to begin with. However, just like Walt Simonson before him, the B grade also to a degree reflects that these are both short runs that had a lot of potential, but that potential was never really realized on page in any of these books. But it should be noted that a B is a little different than a B- like Walt Simonson got. Remembering that this grade is only relative to Avengers comics themselves, and that I spread these grades out on purpose so we wouldn't get 10 different eras with straight A's, it's worth pointing out that though this series is on the lower end of it, out of the 22 eras of Avengers comics we'll be looking at, John Byrne's Avengers makes it into the top 10 overall. It falls apart very quickly and basically turns into a mess. But those early days and the energy behind them is some of the best Avengers content I've ever seen. So yes, it's a very mixed era with a lot of pros and cons kind of going into the extremes, which kind of left it in the middle with a B grade. But it does stand out in Avengers history. I do think any Avengers fan would want to read at least some of this run. And with that, one unlucky writer was forced to start writing for a series halfway through another person's arc, with, as far as I can tell, little to no support or direction from John Byrne. It would be a difficult task for anyone, but Marvel tapped a major writer perhaps best known for co-creating Deadpool, Fabien Nicienza. Fabien Nicienza joined the Avengers series in one of the most difficult situations a writer could ask for. As stated in our previous round, his predecessor John Byrne had essentially thrown a fit and left the series in the middle of a story arc. And it was up to Nicienza to pick over the pieces of this underdeveloped story. The end result is an overly long tale of the Avengers in space with Spider-Man, which Nicienza was unable to improve meaningfully. One can hardly blame the guy. I don't know of any writer who could take somebody else's already bad story halfway in production and magically turn it into a good story. That would be a very difficult challenge for anybody, even a cool writer who co-created Deadpool and over the years created a number of successful X-Men titles. However, I am generally grading the comics themselves rather than the intent of the writers or specific details surrounding what went wrong in the production of these books. At the end of the day, these grades largely reflect the comics themselves, not the drama behind the scenes. That drama does inform a lot of what was going on with the Avengers around this time, and it's worth talking about for that reason. It explains, for example, how a talented writer like Nicienza, who still remains as such all the way here in 2020, is actually writing this Juggernaut series that's ongoing right now, and we have this cool poster for in the background here. Well, a talented writer like that can still not get the strongest grade in the world if he's handed an impossible assignment. One way or another, that Avengers story arc didn't work out, and is one of the worst arcs I've ever read. As the first Avengers comics ever written by Fabien Nicienza, it's a just plain awful start. Beyond just being a dry and drab storyline overall, I don't know what it is exactly, but too often when Spider-Man shows up in the Avengers, he's impossibly annoying and obnoxious, and it's really at play in this particular arc. This very much affected my final grade for this particular time in the Avengers series, but it should be clear right from the beginning that this grade doesn't say as much about Fabien Nicienza as a writer as it should, because there are other factors at play here. There's the artwork, the editing, the culture at the time, the history of the series, the history of comics in general. These are all relevant things to consider when reviewing comics. So I understand why and how Nicienza starts out writing for the Avengers, and it's just terrible. He had no control at first over the characters, no say over the art already produced for this story, and no ability to alter things quick enough to make up for all the problems created by John Byrne. The series had suddenly been derailed and derailed hard, with Nicienza and the larger team at Marvel forced to pick up whatever was left over. What followed basically saved this era of Avengers. Fabien wrote another 6-part Avengers story called The Crossing Line, while writer Michael Higgins wrote an annual featuring John Byrne's team going on a pretty fun adventure with some Atlantean hijinks. And this era would close out with Mark Gruenwald writing a comic himself. It's a very transitionary period with a lot of different writers and artists involved, and based on how I've been doing things, largely skipping over guest spots and only really focusing on major shifts within the ongoing series, the Fabien Nicienza era, if you can call it that, barely hits the threshold of me reviewing and counting it. But while it's very clear Nicienza, Higgins, and Gruenwald were all sort of filling in on the writing side of things while a more permanent fixture for the series could be found, which they basically had to do at last minute thanks to John Byrne, it is worth looking at this era as part of a changing series and an important moment in Avengers history. It's kind of a shame though, because what was supposed to just be a filler arc produced over the year 1990 turns out to not only be important and relevant to present-day Avengers, we'll talk more about that when we get to it, but also a fun vision for what the team could be in this new decade. Paired with artists like Paul Ryan, Tom Palmer, Renee Ritterstatter, Max Scheele, and more, Fabien's story The Crossing Line, which runs from issues 319 to 325, gives us a version of the Avengers quite new from what we've seen before. Largely working with John Byrne's team as a starting point, Nicienza added aquatic-themed superhero Stingray, who I found pretty fun, and focused on a complex story, again with the Atlanteans, but this time in a conflict that also pulled in the likes of the People's Protectorate, a Russian-based superhero team clearly set up to rival the Avengers, and Alpha Flight, the Canadian-based superhero team. What I liked about this story is, in spite of its obligatory superhero standoffs and understandable political tensions between the three nations, the arc of the story really trends towards these representatives of these countries coming together to solve a problem at hand. In spite of it being a very classic Avengers-y story, there's a warmth and optimism I think really fits with the political climate of the time. In the uncertainty of the Soviet Union coming down, with the 90s being a very different world compared to what had come before it, The Crossing Line feels like it sort of reflects an optimism and hope for a potentially more peaceful future, and it fits nicely with Avengers history. There's a certain vision here being presented of the Avengers being part of a larger international community of superhero teams around the world that fits with that political narrative. And those teams all have their own dynamics and political motivations, yet at the end of the day they all want to protect their people along with the world around them. I like this dynamic going on within this story, while the artwork feels increasingly dynamic and fun. We get a great blend of more modern sensibilities with the classic established look of Avengers comics, evoking a transition in the team. Nicienza very much shaped the modern era of comics, though certainly not alone. And though his time with the Avengers was a relatively small part of his career, you could very much see his usual instincts and style for more grounded stories with down-to-earth, action-heavy characters being operated on in these few Avengers comics that he did write. As for the books by Higgins and Gruenwald written around this time, they too are of a similar tone. In all these stories, there are more serious ideas at play with the Avengers at this time, but things are still quite loose, fun, and cheerful. It's the type of balance that works well for this sort of team, and in spite of all the drama he caused behind the scenes, I do have to say Mark Gruenwald isn't a terrible Avengers writer. Based on what I read out of this book, one could argue some of the particulars and conflict he created as an editor for this series wasn't exactly arbitrary, and he might have had a decent direction for the Avengers on the whole in mind when he was pushing for it. I still think Roger Stern and Walt Simonson had better ideas for the team than Gruenwald, but regardless of the interpretation, I think it's worth stating I enjoyed Mark Gruenwald's Avengers comic. For the third era in a row, we are once again awarding a series of Avengers comics a B grade of some form. A B- does indicate it is above average, but having been unable to salvage John Byrne's final story arc, and having it affect Fabien's run so heavily, basically with him just doing that and a single other story arc, this time with the team is very limited, and as such, so is its value. I really like the version of what the team could have been in the 90s as presented in Fabien's larger story, and even the comics written by Higgins and Gruenwald. Tom Palmer and Paul Ryan remain excellent Avengers artists that truly give life and energy to Nicienza's big story arc. If it weren't for the disaster of John Byrne's exit, this era of Avengers would probably have been left with a stronger grade, of course. And I do want to make it clear that I put that blame largely on John Byrne as opposed to Fabien Nicienza, based on everything we know about these people now. Byrne might have gotten a higher grade for the Avengers comics he actually wrote, but he did inflict tremendous harm on the series in a way that damaged not only himself, but others as well, and I think that's worth remembering and making a very clear note of here. Still, I shouldn't come down too hard on John Byrne in spite of everything we know about the man. We weren't there in the offices of Marvel during the production of these books. I was like 0 years old, and can never really know for sure what happened exactly. But we do know what happened next. Somebody over at Marvel, perhaps Gruenwald himself, had a great idea, and had a legend in the world of comic books who had risen up through the ranks writing G.I. Joe comics in the 1980s take a crack at the Avengers. Just 2 issues after Fabien left the series, Larry Hama signed on. Larry Hama, to this day, is a cool dude. Having been working in comics since he was 16, the man also had a brief stint as an actor for about a year, even having been on Saturday Night Live during that time. And then he worked for Marvel on their G.I. Joe comics during the 80s and deep into the 90s. It was a big hit, and at some point, Hama was asked to write the Avengers for a short period of time. Unlike other recent moments in Avengers history around this period, I don't detect any drama behind the scenes this time around. Larry would go on to work for Marvel for a few years after the Avengers, continuing his work on G.I. Joe, and it seems like the plan was always just to have him around for a short period of time before, finally, a long-term writer would be arrived on after him. Based on the man's career, Hama strikes me as the sort of person that enjoyed trying out doing different things before wanting to move on to something else. As just like his time with acting, he only spent about a year on the Avengers. Though he was much more committed to the G.I. Joe series, it also featured long spurts of experimental moments and periods. The dynamics of his Avengers run reflects this too, as he tries out a few different things even though it's only about 7 issues long. So though Hama's run is short, not terribly significant to Avengers history, and only features a small handful of stories, I must stress, in spite of those limitations, this is one of my favorite sets of Avengers comics. These books are an easy and quick read with what might be one of the greatest all-time Avengers art teams in the form of Paul Ryan, Tom Palmer, and both Max and Christy Shield. Hama sets off to tell Avengers stories with a marked increase in quality compared to the last few writers, all of whom I liked at least enough. His first story is all about ushering in a new age of the Avengers, something that happened quite a few times over the years, yet feels distinct this time around. The team begins building a new headquarters in New York City when they are approached by a superhero called Waid. Hama, to date one of only a handful of non-white writers to ever work on an Avengers book, uses this character to correctly take stock of Avengers history up until that point. Black Panther had been an occasional member and ally for years, but there had always been a perceived divide between him and African Americans, and that was like a plot point of at least a few key stories featuring the character, and he never really was a mainstay Avenger. Falcon was added exclusively and explicitly as a move of affirmative action by the government, and left the team shortly after joining because of this. And then finally, Captain Marvel was a girl, so she just plain doesn't count. In spite of my joking, it's a pretty cathartic moment overall, though I've been quick to point out progressive moments in the history where they very much do exist. It matters that Hama was given this opportunity when even a decade ago, it probably wouldn't have been afforded to him. It's worth pointing out back then, Hama got the G.I. Joe series that made him famous because it was looked down upon by established Marvel writers as an undesirable job that nobody else wanted. So rage and all the political baggage he very overtly brings with him, well, it feels like it matches the political baggage of Hama writing for the Avengers to begin with. There's a struggle going on behind the scenes, and even on the page, that feels very much worth exploring, and it's very rarely done outside of this moment. I'm not sure what the wider comic book world thinks of Rage, if anything, but I do like this character. He's certainly one of the more obscure bits of Avengers history for reasons we'll get into shortly, but his frank honesty about the frustration he's felt being a black superhero and just a black American is ultimately well written on close examination. We learned quite a bit about this character through Hama's run, and there's care made to represent the larger black community as a whole effectively and without it feeling like a big cliche. I also really like Captain America's relationship with the character. At first, Rogers is almost hostile towards Rage, insisting the man join the Avengers through the usual processes, which I suppose is usually just by invitation only, without appreciating how that process keeps people like Rage from ever really having a chance to begin with. It's a stark reminder that Steve Rogers did grow up in a very different time, but being Steve Rogers, he soon learns to respect the hero even with Rage's somewhat abrasive attitude, and comes to openly defend the man and show a bit of growth as a character because of that. It's great stuff. I do applaud when writers like Stan Lee or Roger Stern were able to make these progressive moves at a time when the audience was much more hostile to these things by being subtle about it. But when it's done well, sometimes it's good to be overt in your political messaging. Sometimes, in the case of these books, it can be entertaining and interesting. It also feels needed, considering superhero content did, and in many ways still is, unbalanced in terms of race. Most notably behind the scenes, actually. While there have been strong, steady moves since the 80s to make the characters on screen and on page more diverse, At the end of the day, representation has languished in the comic book industry, and it's been that way for decades. It just is, and was an issue that came up once again in 2020. And this uneven level of representation matters a great deal to a lot of people, and affects them quite a bit throughout their lives. These books are great in that this all, at least for a moment, gets a voice, but they are also a little frustrating. As Larry Hama's comics demonstrate, we've been over this issue again and again for decades now. I was still a small tiny child when these books came out, and this topic still gets debated and thrown around, arguably without much meaningful improvement since then. The Avengers of the 90s, outside of even Larry Hama, were suddenly very willing to tackle political issues like never before. That had actually been introduced last era by Fabien Nicienza, but Larry Hama continued that tradition, and I approve overall. Political stories felt like the right and positive direction for the Avengers in the 90s, though I will point out part of the reason they often get flack is you simply have to do a better job at them than the average superhero story. I can forgive a lot in a loose fantasy sci-fi hybrid adventure, but if you're going to be political and make a serious point, well, you need to be a lot more smart and coherent in that process. So the more serious Avengers stories worked well with good writers like Larry Hama, but they also increased the stakes for the series because suddenly a mediocre political story was going to weigh things down a lot more than a generic classic superhero adventure. In the case of Larry Hama, none of this stuff really matters. He does have important stuff to say, and he is a coherent, intelligent writer who delivers his thoughts effectively. Better yet, all of this stuff about racism is paired with a fun bit of action where a Russian scientist is about to explode. And this is where the art team is so important, because a simple bit of conflict like this leads to stunning shots of a man experiencing a nuclear meltdown in the sewer, while the rest of the city reacts to energy erupting from the ground. Visuals so dynamic and featuring a certain flair I wish we got more of in general. In a fun bit, an example of what I'm kind of getting at, the Fantastic Four notice this meltdown happening before their eyes, but don't do anything about it because they trust the Avengers have it handled. The page is so well done, it conveys so much of the humor in that moment, and you have to give credit to the art team for pulling stuff like this off over and over again in the Larry Hama era. Later on, the Avengers battle a wild bunch of monsters, and the series gradually settles back into its usual state of standard superhero adventures, yet the quality of artwork and writing remain intact. In Hama's final story, the Avengers go up against Dr. Doom, something by this point they had already done. But with Hama's writing and that same brilliant art team, we get a story that feels fun, fresh, and invigorating. It's easily one of the best stories featuring the Avengers going up against Dr. Doom, and that includes some pretty hefty stories from the future. With the interesting choice of having Sandman join as a reserve member along with Rage, I found the Avengers under Larry Hama just wonderful. He played up on a lot of the atmosphere introduced to Fabien Nicienza, the cautious optimism of the early 90s with the fall of the Soviet Union, and the way people kind of viewed the world at the time. Hama doesn't spend a ton of time on character development, but I don't really mind that when he does such a good job of showing us a classic roster of the team, mixing in some fun newbies, all working together to solve these problems at hand. This was often the norm throughout Avengers history at this point, and by and large it services the series well, at least for this time. That's especially true when the writing is this well structured and paced while the artwork is this dynamic, as is true of the Larry Hama era. This is what I mean when I make my relatively common complaint that other Avengers writers often waste time over the course of so many issues. In just 7 short books, Hama accomplished a lot more memorable moments and brought out a lot more ideas than most other writers in the team's history in significantly longer runs. And you better believe that will affect the final grade. That being said, Hama's run isn't perfect, and we do need to go over a couple of flaws here. The biggest issue is the short run itself. Hama never seemed to intend to want to stay on to the Avengers for more than the 7 issues he wrote, at least as far as I can tell. Although I will remind you all I can't be sure about the exact details of what went down decades ago behind the scenes over at Marvel's offices. But either way, though I think Hama had some great ideas for the team, this meant a lot of those ideas were never really going to be followed through on. There really didn't seem to be any sort of plan to continue these ideas beyond his short time with the series. The next issue after he left launched straight into Bob Harris's run. Usually, if somebody was fired or quit, there are a few issues that rely on guest writers until the new person can come in. That didn't happen this time around, suggesting to me that Hama was always supposed to be writing the Avengers for a short time, just like Fabien Nicienza. He was probably busy enough with other Marvel projects and a big up-and-coming comic book career, including the still ongoing run with G.I. Joe, so I really don't think there was any hard feelings over all of this with these people. The problem is that it meant that Hama really had no guarantee the norm or tone he set for the team would continue into the next era, and to be honest, it would be silly to assume that. It was great to have Rage join the team to possibly change the way the Avengers looked from here on out, but without Hama around to actually ensure that people grew to care about this character, Rage's introduction and time with the team ultimately comes across as pretty pointless in the long run, because nobody ever really used him again in the series. This is a pretty hefty grade this time around. Hama's run was fun, full of life, and comes highly recommended. Like the eras with a straight B, this makes it to my all-time top 10. But of course, with a B+, it takes that a step even higher, fully competing for that coveted A grade. There's good stuff here, and it has to be some of the best in Avengers comics available to date, but with only 7 issues, there's only so much to go on, and several eras stand out above it for that exact reason. If this run were longer, it probably would have gotten an A- at the bare minimum. But as always, we're grading what exists rather than what could have been. In the mid-90s, after an unprecedented run of short-term writers, things had finally changed with the arrival of Bob Harras, who would take over the series starting with Avengers number 334. Much like how Roy Thomas dominated the late 60s and early 70s, or how Roger Stern took on a huge chunk of the 1980s. Bob Harras is sort of the final chapter in that trilogy, with him largely dominating the Avengers in the 1990s. Like the other two, it is his era most people think of when it comes to Avengers comics from this particular decade, even if Harras had a lot of guest spots and other writers, most notably one of his predecessors, Fabien Nicienza, filling in on occasion. We've been getting a lot of feedback as Grading Avengers has come out from our audience about how much Bob Harras' run means to them, which has sure been interesting for me, as for the record, all these grades were largely finalized before the first video ever came out of the series. Harras had a huge effect on the Avengers, what the team looked like, and how their stories were told for his decade and far beyond. And he did so not just while writing the series, but in many years to come, as a pretty substantial and powerful editor for Marvel and later DC. Unfortunately, I do not have that fond of an opinion of Bob Harras for that reason. Under his time while working on the editorial board of DC, there are certainly a lot of positive things that can be said about him, but his legacy is stained by that of questionable decisions, most especially orbiting around the New 52 line of comics, and far worse than that, a hostile climate he enabled in an industry that has too often sheltered abusive or even dangerous individuals. Bob Harras and others with power like him too often protected these criminals, because that's what they are, while endangering their victims in the process, and his name should never really be mentioned again without keeping that behavior in mind. So I will never like or respect Bob Harras as a person. That ship has sailed a long time ago. But I sure wasn't about to let any of that affect my opinion of the Avengers comics he wrote, especially before any of this stuff had happened. That's especially true given that people like this run for a reason. There's a lot to like here. Reading these Avengers books leaves me feeling strangely nostalgic, even though this was my first time going through these particular Avengers books properly. Harris's new and stable roster allowed him to focus on fun characters like Cersei, Crystal, Hercules, and Black Widow. It's a great roster overall, featuring a ton of characters we had never really gotten nearly enough of in the Avengers up until this point. And they all look amazing thanks to the artwork of Steve Epting. The Avengers have never really had any consistent sense of uniform to them before this era, but the selective use of it with a few characters really brings out a unique look to this particular Avengers run. It gives this time period of Avengers comics this certain flair and visual style that really makes it stand out from other series, which up until now largely had a very similar and consistent look and feel to it between the 60s all the way up until this point in the 90s. Epting's artwork feels like the first big change, a look that's dynamic and full of life in a way that, as much as I love past Avengers artists, reading these books is like entering into a whole new world. This run marks the beginning of a sort of transitional period between the older art, done entirely by hand, to the newer, more modern, computer-enhanced stuff. And it leaves me with this wonderful feeling of it just existing robustly in the world of Marvel Comics. Some characters like Black Widow are drawn in a way that deliberately evokes Jack Kirby's original artwork for the Avengers. while others like Hercules are designed completely differently and feature at least the idea of that Avengers uniform I was talking about earlier. Even though one is kind of bringing us back to the old and the other is trying out something new, both work for me, even when they're being applied to the same team in the same run. It's got this loose quality to the art that really frees it up to explore things in a way I don't feel past Avengers were able to for one reason or another. I also appreciate how consistently Harras keeps these books feeling like Avengers comics instead of 90s era comics that vaguely resemble the Avengers. That does actually happen later on to this series. Like Stern, Harras represents good stewardship of the team and its creative integrity. However, unlike Stern, I sadly have a lot of problems with this run. The biggest issue is by far how boring and dry I find the actual stories. Every time I tried to dig into one of these plots, I found myself loving the warm and fuzzy feelings I got from the art and the characters, only for that to slowly ebb away as each and every one of Bob Harras' stories just drags on across so many issues in these little crossover runs. Often made with heavy collaboration with other writers like Fabien Nicienza, Harras' story arcs are usually well regarded, most especially Operation Galactic Storm. A lot of our viewers were really excited for me to review it and other comics made around this time. I'm afraid, however, I really don't like these books. In fact, Operation Galactic Storm might be the best example of what I'm describing. At 19 issues long, it sure starts out strong and interesting enough, but by the end I'm just shocked that the story is still going on, while the plot itself is not nearly big or interesting enough to actually feature that much comic book content. I didn't find anything exciting or compelling about this story, and certainly not enough to justify nearly 20 issues of content. If you happen to be a fan of that story or anything else we're talking about today, great. All I can tell you is that for whatever reason, I got nothing out of it on just about any level plot-wise. Seeing all the new artwork and characters we'd be getting to know really had me hopeful of what was to come. So I found it very disappointing to see the rest of the story essentially tread water and waste all this solid artwork and the excellent roster. It also really bothers me just how much Bob Harras completely abandoned the more progressive moves of the series made by Larry Hama and Roger Stern. Rage and Captain Marvel were effectively abandoned for good around this point. Though I said that was pretty much always going to happen once Larry Hama left the series after coming in for only a short period of time, it's still frustrating to see. It's very annoying to have the Avengers openly confront its own history with race, only to forget about the notion entirely and immediately after bringing up the discussion to begin with. It's a fair thing for me to complain about because they're the ones who brought it up. In many ways, everything about Bob Harras' Avengers serves as a terrible omen of modern comics, thanks to the future Harras kind of represents, as he would become a very powerful figure in both Marvel and later DC. Excellent artwork often waylaid by interesting stories that get dragged out way too long, lip service towards a more progressive and diverse roster while abandoning it at the first opportunity and never really giving it a chance to begin with, the warm and comfortable nostalgic feelings that often disguise stories that lack any sort of depth. That is every bad habit of the modern age. It's for that reason I kind of found Bob Harras' books very interesting and very worth reading. They are so prophetic of the new 52 and the future of both Marvel and DC in general. Given how Harras was so heavily involved in deciding what writers and artists got chances at both companies, and he very much shaped the trajectory of said companies in the modern age, it makes sense to me that a lot of the stuff he drifted towards as a writer also informed a lot of his decisions later as an editor. Anyone, for good reason, is going to hire and promote people with similar creative sensibilities as themselves. For this reason, these books are kind of really cool to read for any comic book fan who might like to learn how comics came to be what they are in the 21st century. But, if you're checking out these books for that reason, rather than what the creators actually intended, which is the only line of recommendation I can give you, I largely don't count it in the favor for the book's final grade. Harras' Avengers have a lot of problems that leave it at least somewhat in the middle. It gets a very conditional recommendation as a cool little tidbit of comic book history, but that's it. That's all I can give you. While worth reading for a select few for that reason, maybe, and worth remembering as part of Avengers history, definitely, Otherwise, it's not really something that stands well against the test of time, or most importantly, what determines the final grade, how it stands against the rest of Avengers comics. For that reason, fans of this era shouldn't be too disappointed with that grade. The way things worked out, a C- isn't really terrible, but instead feels very average. It's just that Avengers comics kind of set a high standard for themselves, and this run doesn't meet that standard, at which point, because so many runs do, this grade drops quite quickly. When it comes to Avengers comics, that kind of grade generally means an era with a lot of pros and cons, leaving a very mediocre picture overall. And if some of my words in this review have come across as harsh for fans, I gotta tell you, I really didn't enjoy reading any of these books, so one could argue it did quite well in spite of that fact. I could appreciate and find a lot of value in the books, even if overall it was a pretty bleak reading experience beyond all the interesting little behind-the-scene details and tidbits I happened to notice. I actually don't think it speaks that well of these story arcs that what I thought about most when reading this was the behind-the-scenes aspects that rather than the actual stories themselves. And I'm afraid the more I learn about the person, the more I find out about Bob Harras, the more I feel nothing about him was ever all that great. Broadly speaking, I'm glad the man seems to be no longer working with either of the big two companies and won't be in the future, as his legacy, in my opinion, should not be considered a positive one. He's really not that different than Dan Didio. So Harris's run was long and often collaborative. Near the end of his time with the Avengers, he was joined by longtime Marvel editor Terry Kavanagh as a co-writer for a dozen or so issues until Terry took over as the sole writer for the series. And this time period for the Avengers is so different and distinct from the one that came before that I largely credit to Bob Harras, that I absolutely felt the need to create a separate review for the books with Kavanagh's name attached to them. For those that are fans of the 90s era Avengers and have been defending it, I do wonder how often people are referring to this part of Bob Harris's time with the series, because while I failed to connect with most of it, around the time that Terry comes along, my thoughts on the series change completely. Much of that can be attributed to Kavanagh, who as editor for Marvel in the 90s seems well regarded for the creative freedom he offered for writers and artists. That attitude seems reflected in his writing for the Avengers, because everything just suddenly cuts loose. Kavanagh goes big and broad and fills his books with all sorts of neat ideas. Most significantly, though, is the art team that actually did start before Kavanagh joined the series, but seemed to be working in perfect concert with his writing style. It is the most 90s the Avengers get in terms of the stereotypes this decade is known for in the world of comics and its art style. Everything is profoundly over the top, the art takes on this huge focus, and the plot kind of falls to the wayside in comparison. Broadly speaking, I have often criticized 90s books along these lines, but that often has to do with them following the same patterns, slavishly copying the style of popular artists at the time like Rob Liefeld or Todd McFarlane. I find a lot of the books I dislike from the 90s tend to copy the style of those artists without really having any intent behind them, but that couldn't be further from the truth when it comes to Kavanagh's Avengers. These books, with guest artists like Angel Medina, Scott Koblish, John Kalish, Fabio Laguna, MC Wyman, along with the regulars, at this point Mike Deodato and Tom Palmer, who as I said had already started before Terry Kavanagh, this series is given this incredible injection of life I found astounding. I put it on the thumbnail, but I want to make this point very clear. This era of Avengers artwork is my absolute favorite. Mike Deodato at this point is my favorite Avengers artist. He and all the other lovely people I mentioned, along with a handful of others, just go for it with their artwork. The Avengers of this era has a particular style and is very much of its time because of it. But if you're gonna go for a creative direction like this, it's best to pump that gas and go for it hard. If you're gonna do something, especially something like this, there's no settling for halfway measures, and that's not what this book does. It goes all the way. And because of that, we get this colorful, vivid artwork that really stuck with me. Kavanagh and Deodato seem to understand the idea of really going for it better than any other creative team. Kavanagh and Deodato seem to really understand that better than any other creative team in the 1990s for the Avengers. And the end result is one of my favorite 90s comics I've had the privilege to read to date. I often pick on this decade, but it is in part because I know great books like these exist out there. And I also know a lot of the industry could have done better and done more experimental and fun stuff like these Avengers books. I absolutely credit Deodato, Kavanagh, and Tom Palmer in particular for that, because they are the only common element of these books. Harras, a couple other writers, and the other artists would come and go around this time, but it's those three that are the common element that made these books great. The art is so colorful, detailed, and interesting that almost everything else feels secondary and less important. To me, because comics are a fusion of writing and art, it is possible, in the right circumstances, for art to make up for a lackluster story. Kavanagh does it a little bit better than that, though. His style is complementary to Deodato's tendency to go big. It is not only serviceable to the artwork, but it does a really good job at keeping my attention. So even if, as sometimes happens in these books, there might be a weird moment, a goofy little bit of dialogue, or a really silly looking design for Captain America over a couple of pages, none of that really bothers me. Because what's most important is the dynamic and how these books feel overall. Bob Harris's initial run certainly flirted with more interesting art using a wider variety to it, especially compared to what had happened before in the Avengers series. And that's where even before Kavanagh, Deodato, and Palmer already started to stand out. But it's Kavanagh's tendency to write big with them, as I said, and the frequent use of guest artists that meant things really reached a whole new level here. And I think it was kind of needed. It's this kind of artwork that would have made me put a lot more enthusiasm into the first Bob Harras review, if you can count this one as a second. But I don't really want to credit Bob Harras too much for any of this. The series isn't really affected once he leaves, and Kavanagh goes solo for a while with the occasional help on scripts or breakdowns, and the books are still great. To me, Terry Kavanagh is such an essential part of why these books work, and Bob Harras so very clearly is not. I know I clearly have a bit of a grudge against that guy, but I'm strictly talking about the quality of the comics here, and how they changed almost immediately after Kavanagh joined the series, and didn't change after Bob Harras left. So yes, Captain America might look goofy here and there, and there might be a couple of rough dialogue patches elsewhere, but these are small, tiny things that really don't matter much against a series that was really trying out new things. I love the look of Red Skull when he shows up, or even just when we have a more generic adventure with the swordsman returning. It's stunning how a very simple, or even boring story can be so incredibly transformed by artists giving their all. The 90s are kind of famous in the history of comics for really attempting to give artists their due, and credit for the incredible work they do in making these books come alive. To date, it's something that the industry struggles with, and arguably the 90s was actually best at, because at the time, art was pretty sincerely the most important thing to a comic. So it makes sense it would take up a huge amount of the focus for the Avengers as it got deeper into the decade. And while I love these books themselves and don't think their sales were suffering all that much, there was trouble brewing behind the scenes. Through a series of cataclysmic decisions involving larger trends within the industry that changed it into a speculative market, leading to massive overextension, coupled with another series of bad business decisions by Marvel, specifically this whole dispute with Diamond as their distributor and deciding to buy a bunch of failing toy brands, Marvel Comics found themselves on the verge of bankruptcy, with major decisions needed to salvage things and the apparent end of Marvel publishing their own comics. Whatever plans that might have existed for the future of the Avengers came to an abrupt and sudden end. I don't think Kavanagh was ever planned to be a permanent figure within the series anyways, and it seems like since then he's left the industry entirely. But whatever the plan was, he left the series on the eve of the Avengers hitting their landmark 400th issue, and Mark Waid would be brought in to essentially wrap up the now cancelled Avengers series. It's kind of a big deal and does make me feel sad. We're reaching the end of an era after 400 books, and the Avengers would never run as long or uninterrupted again. But don't worry, we still are going to cover those final few issues and more in future rounds. But I had to bring this up now because it's worth marking Terry Kavanagh's time as the true end of an era for the Avengers, one that we can never really go back to. Counting annuals, after well over 400 books, this remarkable series was brought to an end because some people at Marvel at the time didn't do business very good. And it's disappointing to think about, to say the least. But I can also really appreciate that the last true run of books in Avengers history were pretty solid on the whole. Terry Kavanagh and Mike Deodato really put out some fun energy, which was firmly and quite wonderfully pushing the series in a new and cool direction. It didn't last, and ultimately the Avengers had a very different history than what was outlined here. but I do love this take on the team so much more than what would follow not long after. Let it never be said that I hate all 90s comics, because when they work for me, gosh do they work well. It should be made very clear that a B+ is a strong-ass grade, one that we haven't covered before. I realize it seems diminished a bit because we're not in full-blown A territory, but with a scale that by my own rules only exists against other Avengers books, and is spread out such that each letter grade gets roughly the same amount of creative runs attached to it, a B+ really does make this run one of my all-time favorites. Not only does it comfortably slot it in my personal top 10, it also stands out enough to be a real personal recommendation I thoroughly enjoyed. It doesn't quite hit the A, less so for its goofier moments and more so that it was short and sweet without a ton of depth to it. And compared to some other truly awesome runs in Avengers history, well, you kinda need that depth to get to the A. I do feel some other series managed to achieve their own creative goals with an ambition that this series simply didn't have. So in other words, yeah, I really like these books, but they're not nearly as influential as someone like Roy Thomas, or as meaningful as Roger Stern. They are about as fun as those eras though, and that really does say something. When it comes to how it compares to other significant runs in Avengers history, Terry Kavanagh and Mike Deodato keep up with the best of the best. This round, by far, is the shortest we'll be covering for this series, and the sort of thing I would normally skip over. Jerry Conway was a guest writer and did more issues for the Avengers than the three we'll be talking about today by Mark Waid, but I skipped right over that period and maintained the decision to do so. There's just so many rounds to this thing already. We got enough going on here. But those issues by Mark Waid are distinct and important enough that they are worth talking about. First of all, unlike most other guest stints that usually only cover a couple of stories at most throughout Avengers history, Mark Waid's brief run at Avengers does cover three relatively independent ideas. First, the blockbuster celebratory Avengers number 400, and then number 401, which is a bit of a prelude to the Onslaught saga, and finally 402, which isn't much of an ending so much as another chapter in the Onslaught saga. So maybe it's like 2.5 stories, but it's definitely worth talking about. For those that don't know, Onslaught was a being created when Professor Xavier wiped Magneto's mind. The being was only defeated when a number of key individuals in Marvel history went through this portal thing and essentially rebooted themselves into the Heroes Reborn continuity. We'll review what the Avengers were like under that time next, and we've already talked about why this was all happening a little bit last round, so for this round I'm mostly going to focus on the changes made to the series, however brief they were, for these final issues, and the quality of these final 3 issues overall. We start out with Avengers number 400. Out of these 100 issue anniversary specials, I found Avengers number 100 a little disappointing, number 200 absolutely disgusting, and number 300 a little bit frustrating because all of its cool ideas were immediately abandoned. So the Avengers, in my eyes, don't really have this strong legacy of 100 issue anniversary titles. If anything, they are kind of infamous for being bad. So number 400 out of all these 100-issue anniversary books in the original run is on balance my favorite in the whole batch. Though it abandons the more creative artwork of the Deodato days, we do get this more cartoony style that mostly works for what the series is going for. The spin-off series was brought to an end, and the Avengers were kind of brought back together and given a little bit of a reality check. I applaud and really enjoy the more experimental mood of Terry Kavanagh's Avengers, but there is something refreshing about seeing the team we know and recognize. However, digging through Avengers number 400, well, it comes down to little more than a bit of fluff. It's a fun enough book, and I certainly didn't hate reading it, but it isn't exactly my favorite Avengers book or the most memorable Avengers thing I've read for this series. Then we get into the Onslaught stuff, and my frustrations really start to build. I think I like Onslaught best when he was a character in the Marvel vs. Capcom series. The dude looks powerful and the idea behind him is cool enough for something like a fighting game, but these Onslaught books are kind of all over the place and don't really add up to much. What I find particularly odious, though, is the idea that after 400 books of Earth's mightiest heroes going on countless adventures, growing and changing within the industry, this series is brought to an end over a couple of tie-in issues. It gets into stuff that I had as I've gone out of my way to note throughout grading the Avengers, started to build up in the Roger Stern days of the 1980s. By this point, tie-ins and crossover events are a big part of why I didn't like Bob Harris's run, and is the kind of thing where I felt Terry Kavanagh starts to lose a lot of people too. For this series, I tried to ignore the other issues of other series for crossover events as much as possible in grading these eras, but the industry does make that increasingly difficult, and something I'm starting to appreciate is that these events were becoming a nuisance long before the 2000s. This is a problem that's been around longer than I've been alive in the world of the comic book industry, and very much existed in the first volume of the Avengers books, where it feels like this big event essentially consumed the end of the Avengers series. So I don't particularly like these Avengers books by Mark Waid, but for the record, I don't particularly blame him or any of the artists involved in making these 3 books. They were essentially told to ramp up the series in the stupidest way possible, and did their best. But it is worth noting and remembering the presence of Mark Waid here, since, as the Avengers series would continue on in other volumes into the 2000s, Mark Waid would return in a major way going forward. We are far from done talking about this guy, who gets more rounds than any other writer in Avengers history over the course of these future Grading the Avengers episodes. He had, and still does have, this huge influence on the future of the Avengers, so by grading this initial run, however short it may be, we'll have a bit of a benchmark and reference point to compare how these books fare over his future stuff. That being said, as I've tried to make clear, this is just sort of a bit of a useful comparison, a bit of a trivial point of interest for us, because we can't blame Mark Waid too much for this era, and if anything, I believe he did the best he could given the situation that was handed to him. Mark Waid is an interesting writer who around this time was capable of delivering stuff such as the original Age of Apocalypse comics, so it's very easy to believe all this disappointment and frustration I felt when reading his 90s Avengers books, all 3 of them, doesn't really have all that much to do with Waid's abilities as a writer. Now as for the Mark Waid of the 2000s and 10s, and the Avengers he writes nearly 20 years later after these books, well, that's a very different story, and we'll get into that later. So these books are disappointing, and the whole era is basically a dud worth skipping over. It feels like that shouldn't be a huge deal, since it's only a few books we're talking about, and it has a lot to do with the industry basically imploding in on itself at the time. But I can't help but feel as though this really does leave a psychological stain on Avengers history because of where these books are placed. The first volume, which dutifully ran through good times and bad in the industry, was brought to a sudden end, not with a bang, but a truly pathetic whimper. That matters so much more to me than 3 lousy issues happening somewhere in the middle of the series. There's a cost to this that can never be fixed or taken away, not to mention all the confusion inevitably caused by Heroes Reborn and the repeated tendency for Marvel to reboot the series that would follow in the future. It all kind of starts here, and that sucks. All that being said, it is very difficult for me to state it would have been best that none of this stuff ever happened. These moves were part of a larger series of events going on within Marvel that led to them selling off a majority of their characters' film rights to other studios. That in turn eventually led to them developing the Iron Man movie, which, as anyone watching this should know, led to the entire run of MCU movies. Though the MCU is hardly above criticism, you can't deny they haven't opened the window and gates for what movies can do in terms of adapting comics, and you certainly can't deny their success at turning so many Avengers into household names. All of that is a lot more important to me than a few embarrassing comics. Marvel didn't know they were doing it at the time, but these decisions led to some of the greatest comic book movies ever made. But of course, while I feel it is worth noting all of this, and it is worth remembering that as we move on to the Heroes Reborn era, where much of the same can be said of that time, none of it really affects my final grade. It's not in the intent of these books, and it certainly doesn't change anything about them, it's just something worth mentioning before we move on. With little meaningful content, and the Avengers generally being quite competitive when it comes to high-quality comics, this little run of books bottoms out hard in the grading scheme of Avengers, getting just about as low as one can get. While Avengers number 400 certainly had its moments, it does little to dissuade how empty, pointless, and frustrating it feels to end the series on a couple of random story beats surrounding Onslaught, who barely is even a presence in these Avengers books. This team deserves so much better than that, and instead they basically got a big old nothing burger, even with the 400th book. An empty series of comics that are only worth talking about because they basically brought a series of books to an end with little hope or premise for a return to these better days. Certainly nobody at the time could have predicted what would have come after the days of Heroes Reborn, and so all the hope and promise of the 90s trying out different things for the Avengers like they were doing in the Kavanagh days had been killed off in favor of rebooting the entire thing under the moniker of Heroes Reborn. In the 1990s, owing to a number of financial issues we talked about earlier on grading the Avengers, and a shifting dynamic within the comic book industry's culture, Marvel had almost all their titles moved over to Image Comics, and they were completely rebooted under the name Heroes Reborn. It is to date one of the sole attempts from Marvel to ever truly redo their history, continuity, and canon. Unlike DC, who would generally do this sort of thing once in a while with the Crisis of Infinite Earths, or the New 52, Marvel usually uses a sliding timeline that keeps as many, if not all the events in their comic book history part of their world's universe. So Heroes Reborn is a pretty big move and a very distinct moment in Marvel history. It's basically the sole exception of a complete reboot in Marvel history that to date is still kind of part of the Marvel story. It isn't the sort of thing that happens ever really to Marvel canon. But to be fair, I'm not necessarily against the idea behind this in principle. Redoing the Avengers with more modern sensibilities and throwing in some new ideas or characters here and there wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world. And better yet, a lot of this idea basically involved a lot more creative control in these comics. And though this presented an opportunity for Avengers to really try something different, instead I find this series borrows a lot of its roster from the Terry Kavanagh days, including the heavily stylized take of the Avengers, and a lot of its ideas from the Avengers series in general. I think you can best pick out Avengers books from this time based on the appearance of Hellcat, but on the most basic level, I don't really hate that particular take on the Avengers. The Avengers of the 90s are big, broad, and they are most certainly over the top, and that is very much reflected in many of these books. Even the lowest grade we've covered so far, Bob Harris's run, I didn't hate, and I understand the value in it. Though, to be fair, I never found anything in the 90s has really risen to the level of an A grade. And most certainly that is true of Heroes Reborn as well, where, to me, the Kavanagh era and the Heroes Reborn era distinguish themselves from each other with ideas such as a mutated Wasp or a teenaged Iron Man. Heroes Reborn largely sets out to tell the same old Avengers story, just watered down and worse. This reboot does the worst thing any reboot can do, essentially just doing the same thing that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee did when they introduced the original Avengers, only with a substantial dip in quality. I get that some things are subjective, but I imagine people have a hard time defending at least some of the art decisions throughout this run. This is most especially true the more artist and writer Rob Liefeld seems to be involved in the series. It is his artwork that most gets made fun of from this era within the broader comic book community. It is not a fun transition. Everyone is screaming and shouting at each other, and there's a certain quality of ugliness that otherwise is largely absent in the Avengers series up until now. The thing is though, out of the 13 issues this book runs for under the Heroes Reborn title, though Rob Liefeld was kind of in charge of the Avengers book, over time he became less and less involved with both the writing and art. Replacing him were people like Walt Simonson and Jeff Loeb taking over most of the writing duties, and other artists filling in, though still using Rob Liefeld's famous style. And these individuals kind of took over and started doing their own thing. I do have to say Heroes Reborn wasn't an entirely miserable experience. I didn't particularly like these books, sure, but they certainly weren't the worst thing I read for grading the Avengers. Past the first few initial books, which are quite lousy and lame, the series does settle into some pretty classic Avengers adventures without it really feeling like a reboot to begin with. Though, unfortunately, that does make one wonder what the point was of doing a reboot at all, but I digress. Within this 13-issue run, Marvel ended Liefeld's contract with the Avengers early and handed over the series to Jim Lee. According to him, the whole Heroes Reborn experience did improve sales of the Avengers title, and Marvel even wanted to keep Heroes Reborn going so long as Jim Lee promised to draw at least one of the titles under the banner. He refused, and ultimately the Avengers and all the other Marvel titles returned to being published by Marvel itself, with all the continuity even restored, as if it never had happened. It does make one, again, question the point of it all, because it just comes off as so weird and bizarre in hindsight. And while, like I said, I didn't hate it, I didn't really enjoy it much either. I liked the more experimental mood of having the Avengers changed by Terry Kavanagh in comparison. But Heroes Reborn instead feels like retreading old Avengers villains and stories without meaningfully improving that, or if anything, telling the same old stories but just not nearly doing as good a job of it. It feels like way too much of Heroes Reborn is dedicated to revisiting early stuff with Loki and the Enchantress while the team gets to know each other. And that was done in such a shorter amount of time in the Stan Lee and Jack Kirby days, who benefited from far more short little adventures in quick succession. Instead, Heroes Reborn feels like our first take of comics really starting to drag their heels and take their time in telling stories, to the point that ones like this feel slow and cumbersome, while also being bogged down with chaotic art and writing that left me with an overall negative experience. There's a lot of different artists out there involved in this series, and they do bring a certain life and energy to these characters, sometimes, but at their core, they feel over-designed. I look at a character like Thor and he reeks of superfluous details, unnecessary exaggeration, and other little quirks that just rub me the wrong way. What I like about the Kavanagh era is that it understood this art style works well for broad and even goofy stories. Heroes Reborn consistently tries to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to be somber and serious, but its art style never really works for that kind of thing. Where Kavanagh and Deodato were taking chances prior to the reboot, it feels like a lot of Heroes Reborn is just playing it far too safe, relying on older, more familiar characters and stories. And it's a terrible, exasperating attitude to take towards rebooting something like the Avengers. A reboot is the perfect time to take chances, push boundaries, and really do something different. You know, the kind of stuff they were doing before the reboot. It feels as though, from start to finish, Heroes Reborn has this undeserved confidence in itself that you too often see in other adaptations of comics from forces like the world of TV studios or Hollywood itself. It's this belief, often incorrect, that outsider creators think they can do a better job at telling stories they are adapting that have been told for decades. I am a firm believer that adaptation or reboots do invite change and the ability to try different things. What they don't invite is what Heroes Reborn and too many other adaptations go for, which is telling the exact same story, but just different for the sake of being different, or under the false assumption that these creators, by the virtue of their own greatness, can do a better job at telling the same stories and origins of the Avengers that were originally done by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. In my review of the Lee Kirby side of Avengers, I talked about how consistently impressed I was every time I went from one issue to the next, for all the cool moments of art and story packed into those early days of Avengers comics. The talent behind Heroes Reborn just couldn't get anywhere close to that level of creativity. Instead, I found myself going from issue to issue feeling not very impressed, but rather disappointed and let down. This era really did have a lot of potential. Walt Simonson is a cool Avengers writer who I enjoyed of his initial run, and I think we got deprived of him having a real chance to flourish. So it's great that he kind of does have that opportunity here. The artists involved are talented, but not really a good match for the story being aimed for here. And while I don't think a reboot was completely unacceptable of an idea, it was hardly used to benefit this period, and if anything just adds to the unnecessary confusion of Avengers history. In a lesser run of comics, Heroes Reborn would have easily earned an F. Even in the world of Avengers number 200 and all the ridiculousness of the Jim Shooter era, I would have happily let this one get an F too, because there's plenty of room for both. It's just not as bad as the Jim Shooter era. It's just not doing anything nearly as crazy as that, and it stands a full tier above it in terms of quality. From 1998 to 2002, Kurt Busiek and penciler George Pérez joined together for what is, on balance, one of my favorite runs of Avengers comics. I'm not really alone in this sentiment, as this acclaim for this series seems to span pretty far and wide. In my first few days of reading Avengers books, and long since that time, I find these comics get recommended early and often. Busiek and Pérez's Avengers represent a lot in this series and its history. Not only do they have to recover from the reboot of Heroes Reborn and bring the team back into Marvel continuity, which presented its own set of creative challenges in that they'd have to establish how things were going to be from here on out and what kind of stories they were going to tell given everything that had happened, but they were also dealing with major transitions within the comic book world and the larger culture as a whole considering this time period. As the world of comics became increasingly more modern and computerized, a lot of series around this time suffered a bit from growing pains, but I wouldn't quantify this first book in the third Avengers volume as being much of a product of its time. Pretty much any book published around 2001 had to deal with some major changes in the culture and world around it, its sensibilities, and what it might expect out of a story. Luckily, though aspects of art and storytelling do feel dated to this time period, I found a lot of value in revisiting these books, and overall, they very much hold up. What Busiek's Avengers are best remembered for is how they managed to take old and familiar villains like Kang the Conqueror or Ultron, and really letting them cut loose and show off their full power. So yes, Kang has always been, in theory, this powerful foe, but now we get to see him actually take over the world. Ultron was always a dangerous threat, but it's only here that we first truly see that on display when he wipes out a whole country. It's interesting stuff that to date is very much having a present effect on the storytelling in the MCU thanks to the Age of Ultron movie, but I bring up that movie a little reluctantly since it has problems on its own that the actual comics simply do not. No, I find these comics quite polished and fun overall. Where I would argue the story is weaker is in Busiek's new characters, all of whom feel like they lack a lot of staying power. Those being Justice, Triathlon, Silverclaw, and Jack of Hearts. These characters don't really feel like they have a lot of the same sensibilities and never really seemed all that exciting to me in the context of this run. I've seen Busiek jokingly defend these characters in the years since, and I get what he's doing in the moment of these comics, as it fits in with the spirit of the narrative breaking new ground for the Avengers. But I've never really found a reason to care about any of them. The only exception, I would argue, is Firestar, since she was already a more established character and it feels like the Avengers books were more willing to make some use out of her. I think it's because Firestar better fits this model of the kind of character that can become an Avenger traditionally, that she feels more successful than someone like Jack of Hearts, who at this point feels more like a joke. Instead, to me, the characters that are really memorable to this time are the more classic Avengers. Just back to normal, in action, written well, and doing their thing. Captain America, Scarlet Witch, and even Carol Danvers particularly shine in my memory from this time, but we have so many more from the classic roster simply doing their thing well, such as Hawkeye, Thor, and Iron Man. Add to that the fact that the team is back at the mansion, and even though there are some pretty epic adventures and some very serious stories happening here, everything kind of feels at home with what the Avengers have always been. At a time when many comics were going way too dark, very quickly, especially after 2001, Busiek's Avengers really strike a balance during a difficult time, and I really appreciate the whole thing. At a time when America really realized and internalized that the world can change on a dime, Busiek's Avengers make a lot of sense. A villain could conquer the world, or a country could be wiped out, and suddenly those stories don't feel nearly as implausible as they might have once been. These comics reflect a certain tone that the world is indeed changing around it and behind the scenes, but it isn't obsessed with the politics of the day to a fault either, at least not in my opinion. Rather, it lets its politics influence the story without consuming it. The world might be conquered by a villain, but the Avengers are certain to come together and save the day. That tone isn't depressing so much as it feels epic and optimistic. There are big heroes, larger than life, and the threats feel big enough to match that scale and size in a way I do feel many past Avengers comics didn't quite live up to in comparison. As much as I like many of the Avengers comics from the 60s right up into the 90s, many do feel like they struggled in conveying this epic, potentially earth-shattering size of Avengers characters. And I really think Busiek and Pérez's comics are the best expression of that scale that happened up until this point. Earlier in this series I said Terry Kavanagh wrote my favorite era of 90s Avengers comics. That was, I suppose, an error, since half of this run did take place in the 90s. And I do like it quite a bit more than Kavanagh's run for all of its weirdness. However, I might politely suggest that it really reflects how Busiek, to me it feels like the first run of Avengers comics in the 2000s, more than it does a run of the 90s Avengers books that happened to overlap into the next decade. Busiek's writing and sensibilities were forward-thinking and feel very much ahead of their time, and that in turn sets the tone and stage pretty much for every Avengers comic book that would follow. It's also interesting how this run had a very clear and obvious effect on the MCU, which I think is quite interesting. Even though Joss Whedon definitely didn't live up to the best part of the Busiek era Avengers story with Ultron in the Age of Ultron movie. With so much fun to be had and creativity on display, I don't think it's too hard to see why this is, in my opinion, one of the absolute best runs of Avengers books out there. George Pérez is an amazing artist with the portfolio of a god, while Busiek is a Hall of Famer himself. Together, their collaboration is remarkable, and that a few characters felt underused or pointless along the way, I'm looking at you, Justice, remains relevant when discussing this as one of the best Avengers runs ever written. The thing is, though, even a small blemish matters quite a bit at this level, because at the end of the day, there's some damn good Avengers books out there I like quite a bit. Speaking of, there's also another flaw I do want to touch on a bit, since it is going to be relevant when talking about some future Avengers comics going forward. While I adore this particular series, they do feel a little bit like a step towards the past. We get a lot of older characters returning, the newer stuff feels incidental and not all that important to the story, older villains are coming back, even if they are much cooler, and we're going back to the mansion. Sometimes it's good to go back to the basics, and it is certainly worth perhaps hitting the reset button on this stuff, especially the things like the mutated Wasp and teenage Iron Man that occurred during the Kavanagh era. I like and defend that experimental era, but that stuff was never really made to stick around permanently. So when we get right down to things and look at how much of an influence the Busiek comics actually have, it's a little more gray. Beyond the whole connection to Age of Ultron, I am saying this is where the series struggles. You have people out there that we've already talked about like Roger Stern, Stan Lee, Roy Thomas, and a few others who really brought a lot of new stuff to the team, whereas Busiek mostly feels like he's playing with all the ideas already introduced, and sort of just pushing them firmly in a new direction. I personally feel this is actually very important for teams like this. Writers who can look over the history of a team or a character, bring it all together in a way we haven't seen before, even if fundamentally everything is the same. The key is, Busiek develops a lot of the ideas rather than creating. The key is, in this particular one, I feel like what's effective is the ideas Busiek develops rather than the ones he introduces. It works for me more than it doesn't, but I also recognize that is a limitation. Which brings me to... Nobody should forget, as we make our way through this series, how rare an A grade is. With the way things work in this series, I only have 6 to give out of any kind, and so far, this is number 4. I loved it when I first read it, and some of the books years later, and really enjoyed them as I returned to the comics for this series. I recommend you check out the Busiek books for yourself if you are at all interested in the history of the Avengers. Without me having to qualify that statement whatsoever, it's a great series, totally worth checking out. Now, an interesting thing about this series is that there are some Avengers runs, like the Busiek and George Pérez one we just did, that I knew well coming into them and enjoyed thoroughly beforehand. Others, like this one with Geoff Johns, I knew absolutely nothing about. And despite some very real grievances I and any other fair-minded individual might have against Geoff Johns at this point, we aren't really here to grade the person, rather the comics they make. And for those that don't know, when it comes to Geoff Johns, he doesn't have a terrible track record with this sort of thing based on his decades-long work with DC. When we consider some of his better works, like maybe Stargirl, Green Lantern, or the Justice League, while none of those comics were perfect, his take on superheroes and these characters did offer quite a bit in terms of content and ideas. They were far from terrible, so the potential for Geoff Johns to, at some point in history, have had the opportunity to write for the Avengers, in spite of everything, had me quite excited. I knew nothing about this run, and yes, while I dislike Geoff Johns as a person, I came into these Avengers books quite optimistic about how fun they might be, or what sort of ideas Johns was floating in the early 2000s, at a time before he clearly became exclusive with DC. Well, joke's on me, I guess, because this was the single greatest disappointment in all of grading the Avengers, for me personally. While I truly didn't try to come into this run with any sort of grudge or anything like that, these Avengers books are just plain lousy, and a solid example of some of the worst habits from comics in the early 2000s. To Geoff Johns' credit, the books do feel like they were made at a time early in that man's career as a writer, before he really made his name with Green Lantern and Justice League. It's very evident that Johns is still visibly finding his strengths as a writer, bringing that opening story into this bizarre, high-level cosmic event that felt beyond anything the Avengers normally deal with. I feel like the markings of something Geoff Johns as a writer typically doesn't do. It feels because Geoff Johns was then a new writer, he couldn't and didn't really leverage his best qualities as a writer at the time. There aren't a cool new legion of characters or ideas like what he created for Green Lantern. He doesn't have fun with the team or established villains like he would almost a decade later with the Justice League, which feels particularly relevant given the similarity of these two teams. To be fair, it doesn't help that it feels like the sort of thing Geoff Johns would normally do is the exact sort of thing Busiek had already just done. So Johns probably felt compelled to take this series in a different direction beyond his normal comfort zone. The problem is, here in 2021, we kind of know from late-era Geoff Johns stories that the man, as a writer, has a very limited range in terms of what he's capable of. So when we get into some cosmic-level stuff with the In-Betweener, or whatever, Johns doesn't have the kind of interpersonal depth to explore the more lofty and high-powered beings of the Marvel Cosmic Order. Historically, this is not the sort of thing the guy is very good at, not when these Avengers books were made, and certainly not for other stuff Johns would later write with a similar being in Dr. Manhattan for the story Doomsday Clock. So, a story about the Avengers going up against this cosmic-level threat superior to even Galactus has the potential to be interesting if it were in the hands of somebody more thoughtful, like maybe Jim Starlin or Alan Hickman. Geoff Johns, in comparison, comes off quite short. Honestly, though, that sort of just made Johns' early Avengers books dull, but not bad. It gets worse from here. Following the In-Betweener story, the Avengers comics descend into a bunch of boring nonsense that all consistently evoke the themes of the world around them at the time, in a very negative way. Published at the height of the Iraq War, the Avengers comics go from the relatively timeless and optimistic tones of the Busiek era and slam straight into Geoff Johns with a sudden sense of pessimism and 9/11 inspired imagery that just bums me right out. While there is a time and a place to explore such things, and the Avengers might very well be an effective way to do that, Geoff Johns feels even less equipped to handle this content than he does the Cosmic Marvel stuff. To be fair, it is easy to understand how he got a little caught up in the political climate of the time, and he was likely moved to evoke some of the imagery coming out of the earlier 21st century. Just as a human being, I can relate to that. The books are not written too cynically, and I'm not saying they are offensive. Well, they are offensive, but offensively bad. And that's just in terms of the quality and my subjective opinion. These comics didn't come across as overly hateful to me, but the thing is, you can have a well-written, darker Avengers story, and it can pay off, often in ways more memorable and meaningful when compared to lighter, more comedic content. However, there's always a risk in going dark. When handled poorly, well, you get Geoff Johns' Avengers. Now, up until this point, I've been focused on the writing, but as always, that's only part of the equation when it comes to evaluating comics. Unfortunately for this era, I am not a fan of the art made for these books. It ranks very poorly when compared to Avengers history, with only stuff like Heroes Reborn looking worse. That's a very reductive thing to say for something very subjective, but the art by Kieran Dwyer absolutely constitutes this messy, miserable-looking disaster porn that permeates far too many comics from around this time period. I don't know much about Dwyer, but from what I've seen of his art, though it does have its moments, at the best I can say I'm not a fan, but more honestly I'd go so far as to call him amateurish. The kind of thing I really only give a pass to a low-level, indie comic where the talent's just starting out for the first time. Other artists like Ivan Reis fare better, but are just around for guest spots, while the second half of Johns' time with the Avengers, Olivier Coipel steps in. He, in comparison to Dwyer, comes across as much more competent, but then Geoff Johns goes and makes things miserable just the same. Meanwhile, as fallout from the Busiek arc, the Avengers are given international authority by the United Nations. It's an interesting idea that had been teased before in the comics and could have made the books more political or interesting, but instead nothing's really made of it. The books certainly try and appear political, but the politics are superficial. The message really doesn't seem to be much more complex than terrorism is bad. And I mean, yes, it's bad, but I don't really think we need an Avengers book to painstakingly spell that out for us. And in defense of that message, there was plenty of media being created from around this time that had that very simplistic tone to it. But at the very least, those things were entertaining along the way. And so ultimately, if the comics are neither thoughtful or fun, they have nowhere else to go. What could have been this memorable and awesome run where Geoff Johns, the guy who remade Green Lantern, inventing 9 additional Corps to fill out their universe, the dude who wrote one of my all-time favorite Justice League stories, Origins, along with other generally well-regarded Justice League works like Forever Evil and The Darkseid War. That guy wrote the Avengers, and it is sadly, utterly, completely skippable and forgettable. Whatever my feelings about the guy personally, I know Johns as a writer can be a lot of fun. So it's profoundly frustrating that not a hint of that joy exists in these Avengers books. Now, I know I've ragged a little hard on Johns throughout this review, and as a reminder, he absolutely deserves it, but I am going to come to the defense of him and pretty much any other writer we've talked about in this series. I've mentioned this before in grading the Avengers, but not only are these grades subjective, but I don't really know the exact circumstances under which these comics were made. I, and basically no one but the people involved, don't know what conditions Geoff Johns was allowed to write the Avengers under. But we do know he was relatively new to this world of comics, and at the time I don't think he had a lot of creative control. We don't know what editors or executives might have been up to at the time, or how that might have affected Dwyer or Hopewell's work along the way. I chose, knowing full well there was a lot of baggage to this, to use writers as a sort of earmark for eras in Avengers history in making this series, since they tend to best define distinct runs of comics within this series. However, we should never forget how collaborative these books really are, and often little things like coloring, which by the way, also wasn't really great in this particular run of Avengers books, that stuff can affect my final grade quite a bit, even if it doesn't necessarily involve Geoff Johns or his input or talents whatsoever. So, with all that in mind, yes, it's time for another hefty D, our third in the series so far, all within several years of one another in terms of publication time. Outside of the Jim Shooter era, this time in Avengers history, basically from the beginning of the Onslaught saga all the way into here, marks a pretty low point in the history of the Avengers, with the obvious exception of Kurt Busiek's run with George Pérez. It seems like Marvel took the wrong lessons away from the Busiek and Pérez's run in the decisions going forward. In my review for that run, I praised how great and timeless those early stories felt in Avengers Volume 3. Comparing that to the later stories with Geoff Johns is very rough, because, for all these reasons I just described, this era contrasts heavily in terms of how dated it feels. Still, for all my criticisms, fans of the Johns run might note that this is a D+, a little bit higher than stuff like the Onslaught Business or Heroes Reborn, and an awfully lot higher than Jim Shooter's run, which is consistent with how I feel. While Geoff Johns' era was boring, gross, silly, full of problems, and thoughtless, it was still competently made compared to the true low points in Avengers history. But just barely. This is another round where I knew very little about the books going in, but I certainly know enough about the writer. Chuck Austen is best, and perhaps unfairly known for being the guy who had to write the X-Men after Chris Claremont. An unfortunate position that I feel has kind of earned Austen a reputation he doesn't necessarily deserve. To be fair, people have a lot of beef with this guy because of his almost abusive relationship with fans who are giving him crap for his X-Men comics in the early days of the internet. Personally, however, I feel as though Austen's particular brand of toxic behavior is a little more nuanced than my more hostile and frustrated feelings I have voiced towards people like John Byrne or Geoff Johns in this series. As far as I can tell, to me, most of Austen's behavior is him being awful to people who are already being pretty awful to him. Comic book fans can be toxic too, and they sure seem to have been towards Austen, though I admit I wasn't really involved with the comic book community around this time period, so this is just sort of what I've gleaned over the years. And I had all of this in mind when I was looking at his Avengers comics. Austen didn't last very long with the Avengers before Volume 3 was cancelled and Brian Michael Bendis essentially took over with Avengers Disassembled. But I came into what limited comics Austen did write for the series with a very open mind and heart, knowing what I know. And overall, I was more impressed than disappointed. Once again, I do feel like I am pushing against popular opinion, which seems to be slanted towards this being one of the lesser Avengers runs, but I'm not going to pretend there aren't some rather serious flaws going on with these Avengers books either. These Avengers, oddly enough, remind me a lot of the Ultimates, a reboot of the Avengers published kind of around this time that reimagined the Avengers. Though, as far as I can tell, produced independently of one another, both the Ultimates and Austen's particular take on the Avengers crank up the drama to the highest possible levels and almost seem like they're parodying each other because of it. Both rely on these screaming matches that read as though it's the Avengers' first attempt at adult drama, and the comic book world was utterly unprepared for it. The arguments in Austen's run feels like a toddler's idea of maturity, written by somebody who has seen adult people argue with each other, but never actually had an adult argument themselves. That being said, some of the drama is done really well. The civilian dying itself, a woman who was basically just a random mom caught up in the middle of the fight, is uniquely striking in Avengers history. Very rarely is action in an Avengers story brought down to this scale and given this level of emotional depth. Then the death itself sort of gets undermined by this Captain Britain nonsense, to the extent even this civilian gets a comic book death. That sort of contradiction with both good and bad stuff is kind of inherent to Chuck Austen's run. I wouldn't call it great, but it has some good moments. I wouldn't call it awful either, but it also has some very stupid lines of dialogue, and all the cool stuff I like about Austen's time with the Avengers feels like it starts early and fades fast over the 7 issues he writes, getting pretty boring by the time he wraps things up. So Chuck Austen's Avengers is a story of extremes. At times, it is doing stuff that no other Avengers book has really done before or since, but it's also just so awkward and clumsy. That imbalance kind of pulls me in both directions when evaluating this book. In spite of me having a sort of impressed opinion overall, it's not that great either. It's evident in the team itself. While I feel like Hawkeye's writing leaves a lot to be desired, this is the best Wasp has been in an Avengers comic since she led the team in the 1980s. Not only does Janet get to shine with new giant powers that are used in a bunch of creative and fun ways, but she also gets the most wonderful and cathartic chance to chew the ever-loving crap out of Hank Pym. I talked a lot about how Roger Stern did quite a bit to repair the damage done by the Jim Shooter era to Pym and Janet Van Dyne's characters. But it feels like he could only go so far. It's in Austen's run that we're finally able to give these characters some closure here, with Janet finally able to both confront and hold accountable her abuser, laying out everything that had been pulled in the Jim Shooter run and other troubling moments, including stuff from the Geoff Johns era I kind of just brushed past when reviewing that particular run last round. I give Austen a lot of credit for this, because this is where Austen seems to struggle the most. It seems like he wants to write these more mature comics, but his instincts seem to lean towards somebody who also wants to have more fun. I kind of get the impression he wanted to be sillier, more than what the culture of the time allowed for. These comics were published in the early 2000s, at a time when it was cooler to be rude, arrogant, a twat like Hawkeye, and when more lighthearted content was generally out of favor. Like the Geoff Johns era, I think the Avengers have a very limited place in that role, and require hefty talent in order to go dark. Like Geoff Johns, Austen didn't quite seem up to the task, but I feel as we start to really examine this era, it's going to look a lot better than Geoff Johns overall, and his run of Avengers books have solid moments, more so than the Johns era because of it. So while both suffer a bit from changing cultural norms, kind of going against what makes the Avengers best, Austen's comics hold up much better, and the final grade will reflect that. Because it's here where we get the full modern force of computers really benefiting what artists are capable of these days when producing Avengers art. Anyone who has been watching these videos knows I love myself some classic Avengers works, but by the time Austen comes along, Olivier Coipel suddenly starts thriving as an artist, compared to his days with Geoff Johns, giving us these dynamic and exciting action pieces that really go above and beyond anything we've seen before in this series. It's uncanny how much better this artist looks and feels with a writer like Chuck Austen compared to what had come before, and it makes me feel like Olivier's art largely was wasted for his Avengers books outside of the ones he got to pencil for Austen. Overall, it's not so much that I feel that Coipel and his inker Andy Landing got more talent from their time with Geoff Johns, but rather Austen's writing was better at facilitating their talents as artists. Similarly, Scott Kolins takes over for Austen's final 3 issues along with Chris Sotomayor, and I think they do a really good job too, much better than what the same creative team did with Geoff Johns. I know I'm ragging on the Johns era quite a bit here, but it's because we have the same art teams going in with a different writer, all working right around the same time period, so it's a very relevant comparison. Like I said last round, it's difficult to identify what changes between eras of Avengers. It could be the writing or the editing, but I think we know for sure it's not the art. Because the art's great overall, and definitely buoys up my final opinion of these 7 books on the whole. Speaking of which... excellent art, crisp action, solid moments of character work, all paired with silly dialogue, awful bits of character moments for every good one Austen does, and a somewhat boring second half, make this particular run of the books kind of all over the place. As a result, I wound up giving it a grade right in the middle. While it is far from average, everything that makes it good is kind of balanced out from everything that makes it terrible, and that wound up putting it right in the middle of this grading scheme. It's interesting overall, and I do think a lot of Avengers fans would get something out of reading it, but it isn't quite good enough for me to justify a full-throated recommendation. I just can't quite put my heart into that, and if you're looking for cool Avengers books, there's a good chunk out there I'd suggest you look at first, pretty much everything with a B- grade or higher, before you come looking here. Still, for somebody with a reputation in comics like Chuck Austen, you could do an awful lot worse than a C+. Following Volume 3 of The Avengers, a volume with a lot of ups and downs I've covered over the last 3 rounds of grading The Avengers, an interesting and kind of unprecedented thing happened to the team. With a then relatively new writer named Brian Michael Bendis taking over, the old numbering very briefly returned for a single story called Avengers Disassembled. In a pretty shocking move at the time, long-term team member Scarlet Witch began suffering a severe psychological breakdown, with her powers spiraling out of control. Over the course of 2 stories, both written by Bendis, Avengers Disassembled and House of M, both the X-Men and the Avengers as we knew them were effectively dismantled. This all took place in the fallout of Wanda's growing abilities coupled with her degrading mental state. It's a lot to unpack all at once, and I don't want to get into this one specific story too much since we're just focusing on the Avengers part here, but the effect this had on Avengers history is very significant in and of itself. Not only does Avengers Disassembled feature a great deal of characters dying in this stupid, overdramatic way that would be felt in canon for years to come, it would also mean that Wanda, one of the most sustained, permanent fixtures of Avengers history, was suddenly given this blemish of a character trait, this scar to her history with the team, I don't think is exactly fair or necessary. It certainly doesn't feel like a positive example of how to write a powerful female character. But I will defend this a little bit, saying at least this notion is up for debate, since the larger character arc of Wanda Maximoff is a story of her ultimately overcoming and triumphing over her issues. But boy, that journey, as it takes us from Avengers Disassembled all the way to Avengers vs. X-Men, when all this stuff sort of gets resolved, is a long and often very painful one. That journey is kind of what we're talking about today. During that time, a number of series cropped up, first in the form of New Avengers, also written by Bendis, and featuring a number of characters that up until now were largely excluded from the Avengers roster, specifically Spider-Man, Spider-Woman, Wolverine, and Luke Cage, coupled with originals like Iron Man and Captain America returning, along with real wildcards like the Sentry kind of floating around, and we had a very fun and effective new team of Avengers that largely defined the team in the early 21st century. I really like these early days of New Avengers. The art is solid, unlike Avengers Disassembled, and the initial stories are a lot of fun. Breakout, the very first story depicting how the New Avengers came together, is genuinely inspiring and a tremendous time. It is easily one of my all-time favorite Avengers stories, and definitely buoys up my overall impression of this particular era in Avengers history. The second story is all about Wolverine in the Savage Land, and in my opinion, it also does a great job of showing how a murder-happy character like Logan can still find his place in the team with the Avengers, even with Captain America and Spider-Man and their much more strict moral codes. Yet as the series went on, it became more and more beholden to tie-in events. Instead of the team relishing in some of the valuable time spent on character development early on in the New Avengers run, most of the series is actually more like a tour guide, shuffling us lazily from one exhibit to the next. The exhibits being events like Civil War, Secret Invasion, and Dark Reign. Then everything just sort of fizzles out in a very disappointing way. My overall impression of the first volume of New Avengers is that, while it has a couple of really good stories at the beginning, too much of the rest of the series goes nowhere. And this volume overall isn't that great. That's actually why I'm grouping all these stories together. Avengers Disassembled, New Avengers, Mighty Avengers, Dark Avengers. While they each have their own individual moments, and some have better art and artists than others, most of it was written by Bendis, and all of it pretty much equals out to the same level of quality. I almost was very ready to skip right past this particular run of books. We are looking at books with just Avengers on the title, not West Coast or any other spin-off or prefix to it, since there are so many of those that I could easily do an entire series creating the Avengers spin-off books on their own. And we might do that one day. But these particular Avengers books are a little different. It's hard to call any of them full spin-offs since for a while, the New Avengers were the Avengers. There was no core Avengers team beyond that. The Mighty Avengers were created as a result of the breakup of the team following the superhero Civil War, and they too kind of considered themselves the official Avengers. Later, the Dark Avengers were the official Avengers once Norman Osborn took over S.H.I.E.L.D. for a little while. Throughout all of that, the New Avengers were still kind of around in this unofficial underground team capacity, composed of heroes not willing to play nice with the authorities as the political landscape changed. It was interesting stuff at the time, but in hindsight largely feels like it was more interesting in the ideas being floated around rather than the actual execution of them. When I focus on the actual books that are published, a huge stack of books all written by Bendis, rather than just some of these key moments that appeal to me across these books, I start to look back on this era with more sober eyes. I still think of stories like Breakout and a few other gems along the way hold up well, and are solid Avengers stories on their own. I am also mindful that this era of comics is also very important to the shape of the world of Marvel as it exists today. For better or worse, the event-heavy mindset of the time means that the team's history during this time period is very important for what's going on with them even today. Neither Steve Rogers nor Tony Stark have ever really seemed to have fully forgotten or gotten over what went down during the Civil War or the events that followed, nor should they. We learn about the Illuminati during this time, which would have huge, devastating ramifications in future Avengers books. Though I don't love Secret Invasion or Dark Reign, they do have their moments too. And it all quite nicely does lead to Siege, a Marvel event I actually like, that also brings us nicely into the next round of this series, where the Avengers were reunited, and we'll be taking a look at the fourth volume of Avengers, as written by Bendis, next time in this series. But before we get into that, I do want to talk about how great artists like David Finch and Stuart Immonen were doing awesome stuff with books like New Avengers and a couple of other stories we've talked about during this era. Both are kind of showcasing just what could be achieved in the modern age with artwork. With the benefits of computer software in full effect, these books reach a level even Avengers Volume 3 only ever kind of flirted with. While there will always be a place for classic comic book art, seeing stuff like the Savage Land drawn by these talented folks does bring the Avengers to a whole new level we really haven't seen before. However, every time we have an artist like Immonen or Finch firing on all cylinders around this era, we do have stuff like Mike Deodato and his work for the Dark Avengers. Now, I like Deodato and a lot of his work elsewhere, but here, he and other artists kind of feel uninspired. Like they were just sort of phoning it in, or were in kind of a rush. Something's off, but I do feel that's part of the problem overall with this era of Avengers history. It suffers from a lot of bloat. It's trying different things, it's got a lot of ambitious ideas and political thoughts, but because you have people like Mark Millar or Brian Michael Bendis at the helm, they can't really quite pull it off, and instead it just leads to an excess amount of content. Perhaps it's also because at the time Marvel knew the Avengers were the only characters they still had film rights to. For whatever reason, we got a lot of comics at this time with Avengers somewhere in the title, or the team being heavily involved, a trend that would continue well after this era, come to think of it. The sheer volume of comics definitely has an effect on my overall final grade, But I think it's fair to group these all together, too. There isn't much of a change in quality, so they all end up roughly in the same spot, grade-wise. So with all that in mind... Yes, for 2 eras in a row now, I'm doling out a C+. And since, as part of the rules we've established for grading the Avengers, I'm only giving out 2 of the exact same grade to any era, that means these are the only C+ grades to be found anywhere in grading the Avengers. Like the Chuck Austen run, I find these books very uneven. Every time there's something amazing, like Breakout, there's 5 other lackluster or outright silly stories that sort of drag it down. And even just picking out an individual series like New Avengers would have resulted in the same grade, since those books also get boring after a while. At the end of the day, Bendis just didn't quite have the energy to bring it all together on a consistent basis. So I find these books have kind of reached a sort of middle ground with me. Like Chuck Austen's era, I wouldn't really consider it average, it's just kind of very lackluster with occasional spontaneous moments of excellence. The Avengers had and would once again see better days in the future, and to their credit, between Avengers Disassembled all the way to Siege, Bendis, Millar, and the others at Marvel were clearly trying different things. Through continuing the trend of Avengers Volume 3 and trying to be more political and dark, we were able to get the Avengers in directions never seen before. I just wish we had more talented writers doing it. Because at the end of the day, Bendis and Millar are just simply not as thoughtful of writers as others in the industry. Well, here we are at the cusp of round 20 of grading the Avengers. Yeah, we have to talk about Brian Michael Bendis a little bit more. I don't begrudge the guy too much. He does have his moments as a comic book writer throughout his career, but oh boy does he not look good for this particular video series. After a lengthy run of Avengers-related spin-offs and titles by Bendis we covered in the last round, following the event Siege and all the way into the event Avengers vs. X-Men, Bendis finally got the chance to write the core Avengers team that had finally returned after years of cancellation. Though there is something to be said about the new Avenger. As I was talking about last round, I did enjoy it, even if it has problems. It was an exciting time to be a Marvel fan at the start of the heroic age. After years of being gone, and to be fair, I was a comic book fan at the time, and the Avengers very much felt gone during that time. Thor, Cap, and Iron Man reunited with a new roster. It is at this point that these 3 really start to become this core part of the Avengers, and that's something Bendis really seemed to push. It was nice to have Thor back, who really hadn't been an Avenger much after Volume 3, and the whole new roster just felt like the Avengers being back in force, with a team restored and united to make it really feel and look like the Avengers. But an Avengers changed by everything that had happened. So bolstering classic characters is a huge amount of Bendis' personal favorites from his New Avengers days too, like Spider-Man, Wolverine, and Spider-Woman. What's best about this is that roster is full of interesting character combinations that could have brought a lot to this time period in Avengers history. Although you might note the tone I'm taking already here. But I'm not even done talking about all the good potential on the table yet. There was one final wrinkle, and I think it could have been a cool twist. Bucky Barnes, once a sidekick to Captain America, then Winter Soldier, had at this time been named the new Captain America and joined this new team of Avengers. On paper, there's a lot to be excited about for Avengers Volume 4. Though I found the previous round of Bendis Avengers comics quite middling overall, as I said at the start of this video, Bendis is perfectly capable of making excellent books. Ultimate Spider-Man had a big influence me on becoming a comic book reader, while he did pretty admirable stuff with characters like Daredevil and Jessica Jones back in the day. So I didn't come into this volume ready to write this guy off entirely as a writer, and I do admit I read very few of these books beforehand. So I came into this round having not read many of these particular books, unlike the last round, and kind of coming into it with an open mind. There were a lot of cool Avengers on this team, and it helps matters that the art of this era was done with pencils by John Romita Jr., inks by Klaus Johnson, and colored by Dean White as the initial art team. These books look and feel interesting compared to other modern Avengers stories. They are relatively more cartoonish, and simple designs don't really match the more realistic and detail-oriented tones of the modern age, but instead evoke, to me, a more classic sense of art sensibilities from the Avengers' earliest days. But over time in the series, we have a lot of different artists and creators shuffling in and out of the series, and I start to lose sense of things. It becomes a very inconsistent book in terms of how it looks. Once Romita and the gang take a step away from the Avengers books, everything falls apart in terms of art consistency. Of course, that is the biggest problem with this series. But it started in the 1980s, and I was quick to note when it happened in grading the Avengers, took hold in the 1990s, and firmed up in the 2000s, was by the time Volume 4 of Avengers came around, the plague of comics. I am, of course, referring to these tie-in crossover events. Just like last round, this Avengers series starts out at least somewhat decent, before turning into a boring slog of tie-in issues or filler in between these big events. However, unlike something such as New Avengers, Avengers Volume 4 doesn't start all that strong to begin with. The first story is all about time travel, a fun enough idea in and of itself, and especially for the Avengers. But if you know Bendis as a writer, you know that he tends to rely on time travel as a crutch for narrative purposes, and every time he does, it sucks. So it's pretty unoriginal as a writer for Bendis to do something like this here, though to be fair, this is an early example of him doing it. But even just looking at it as an Avengers adventure of any kind, it leaves a lot lacking. We get a glimpse of some cool characters and ideas from the future, but nothing is really made of it, and the whole story arc doesn't really come together, focusing way too much on Iron Man at the cost of all the Avengers. Which would be fine in and of itself, except for that is all Avengers Volume 4 does. Then we have the most interesting story in all of Avengers Volume 4, where all of the stuff about the Illuminati that I was talking about last round suddenly becomes public knowledge among the superheroes of the world of Marvel. It leads to a very tense standoff between Iron Man and Steve Rogers, along with the rest of the Illuminati members. The only problem with that is it once again involves exactly one person actually on the Avengers team at the time, in the form of Tony Stark. Everyone else on the team just sort of stands around while the Illuminati sorts this stuff out with Steve Rogers. And again, remember that Steve Rogers isn't even Captain America on this Avengers team at the time. From there it's a straight shot to the event Fear itself all the way into Avengers vs. X-Men, at which point Avengers Volume 4 was cancelled. And these stories are so unremarkable and unrelated to Avengers themselves, it really feels like I don't have much to say about these tie-in books whatsoever. The events themselves are okay. Fear itself and Avengers vs. X-Men are entertaining in their own rights, overall, with some solid moments, but the actual Avengers tie-ins feel pointless and largely a distraction from the Avengers having their own series and stories. It really feels like this volume, more than any other time in Avengers history, is where the tie-ins are most affecting the actual Avengers comics. In the past, these tie-ins would happen less frequently, and even then often felt like they derailed the series pretty severely. In the future, tie-in comics would be published as their own mini-series, a wonderful change that made it much easier to ignore them if they happened to be annoying or pointless. This trend is really bad in Volume 4. Effectively, the Avengers during this time couldn't really be about anything other than the events. The sprawling roster of fun Marvel characters that could have had a chance to shine here are instead largely ignored for the entire 30-plus issue run. This applies to everyone on the team equally with the sole exception of Iron Man, because this might as well be Tony's series for the first few arcs. No other character really gets a chance to take center stage across Avengers Volume 4. And the absolute worst, most insulting example of that is Bucky Barnes. Bucky being Captain America and on the Avengers was a unique opportunity and a rare, fleeting moment in Marvel history. The idea of him working with the Avengers side by side fascinates me, but sadly, I remain tantalized by the idea only. In Avengers Volume 4, Bucky Barnes as Captain America doesn't have a single thing to do, and before he really gets to have any sort of moment as an Avenger, his time as Captain America is suddenly brought to an end during the Fear Itself story, as did his time with the team. Before we knew it, Steve Rogers was back, Bucky's time as Cap was relegated to a part of trivia in Marvel history, and he never got to be an Avenger the way so many other superheroes were able to be over the years. I can forgive a lot from Brian Michael Bendis, and as I tried to make clear in the last round, I actually do like a bunch of stuff that man has written over the years. But I really struggle with this. As people have said in the comments, and I myself have said when referring to Geoff Johns, we really don't know to what extent these people had power or control over their own stories, due to Marvel and its editorial influence. So it's important not to judge Bendis too much for that, but it is a shame. No other writer has or may ever have the chance to write a Bucky Barnes Captain America on the Avengers team again. Certainly not in the mainstream continuity, at least not very easily. And Bendis essentially squandered the whole idea, gave away the opportunity for just another of his boring, lazy time travel stories, or a bunch of nonsense about his Illuminati, followed by filler nonsense taking us from one tie-in event to the next. While Bucky as Cap was certainly explored elsewhere at this time, this was his chance to be an Avenger, and either Bendis or Marvel couldn't even be bothered to give it a second thought. Yep, it's time for a big drop for Bendis in terms of grade compared to last round. D grades are rough through and through, and you know you've messed up when you start entering Heroes Reborn territory. But Bendis' only run of true Avengers books, stripped away of all the new, mighty, and dark gimmicks, profoundly feels lacking in quality. This is the Bendis from his mid to late career at Marvel, where he feels like he lost whatever edge he might have had as a writer in his earlier days. Though the art isn't nearly as bad as some of the other stuff we've seen in this series, it's one of the more boring and lackluster runs in all of Avengers history overall. Given that it barely has any importance in terms of continuity outside of the Illuminati stuff, and it was published on its own, standalone volume, like every other Avengers run from here on out, it becomes one of the most skippable runs in Avengers history, and I recommend you would avoid reading it for this very reason. So here we are at round 20 of grading the Avengers. With only a few left after this, I'm really interested to see how people feel about some of the most recent Avengers books, starting with this one here. This particular volume is recent enough that we are broaching the earliest days of Comic Island itself, to the extent that Joey and I have already pretty thoroughly recapped the events of Time Runs Out. I'll attach the associated link to the video I'm referring to here, which should give some people an idea of what's going on, but in short, Avengers Volume 5, or Time Runs Out, as the larger narrative of this creative run is referred to, features the Avengers going up against a threat unlike any they've faced before, the entire end of the multiverse and all known reality. Largely focusing on the Illuminati as its main characters, these Avengers books focus on the discovery of these incursion events, where universes have begun to collapse in on one another. It leads them to a situation the Avengers, as they stand, are basically unable to grapple with morally. To survive, the only way forward is to destroy other Earths so both universes can live. But outside of rare situations, that means destroying an Earth populated with people, no different from the one we live on now. The moral implication of these incursions essentially breaks down, psychologically, every Avenger involved. Steve Rogers, who joined the Illuminati as a result of events in Avengers Volume 4, clings to his morals so stubbornly he literally would have gotten every human being on his Earth killed, and as a result wiped out all of reality with it, while characters like Tony Stark, Namor, and Doctor Strange basically corrupt themselves and become villains in order to keep the Earth still standing. The story is much more complicated than this, bouncing back and forth between the main Avengers series and a run of New Avengers comics, while also heavily involving crossover events Age of Ultron, Infinity, Original Sin, and Axis. This is by far the least accessible and one of the more event-heavy runs of comics in Avengers history. So perhaps I'm about to make myself a bit of a hypocrite when I say I truly love these Avengers books and this story. While I recognize that the biggest flaws are they are very demanding runs of books that are not only event-heavy but have you know a lot of stuff about the world of Marvel and its history from its earliest days all the way into the 21st century to truly appreciate everything Hickman is going for in this run. But none of that really bothers me because I know these things, I've read these books, and as much as the tie-ins can be a nuisance, they often, and kind of uniquely, work in favor of actually adding to the story of Time Runs Out. Age of Ultron felt like it was a sort of force that propelled the incursions forward, forcing various characters to act with regards to them. Infinity brought Thanos and the Black Order into the equation, and they all proved to be an essential part in Earth's continued survival. Original Sin brought Steve Rogers back into the story after the Illuminati, in my opinion, rightfully wiped out his memory so they could continue going about the business of keeping Earth safe. And finally, Axis was Tony's particular nail in the coffin, sending his character into full villain mode and putting him once again in direct opposition with Captain America. And it's kind of cool because this time I'm pro Iron Man for this story. All the old morality and beliefs of superheroes feel like they fall apart in the face of incursions. You either hold to your principles and die, like Steve Rogers wanted to, or you go on living, hoping you survive long enough to reverse everything. Tony Stark is largely right throughout this story because of that, as is Thanos, Doctor Doom, Doctor Strange, and a host of other more practical characters. Faced with this kind of oblivion, these characters were right to go into a mode of survival at any cost. In comparison, Captain America, while morally right, would have gotten everyone killed. The Illuminati are directly involved in events that ultimately preserve all of reality in a way Rogers simply couldn't have because of who he is. And it doesn't make him look particularly endearing. In some ways it feels like it's just so he could basically pat himself on the back and tell himself he did the right thing, as oblivion strikes all around him. It's a rough attitude for me to take towards Captain America, but it does reflect his behavior in general, too. We look at Steve Rogers in a moment like Civil War, leading a movement that is morally on the right side of history, but practically lacks any realistic goals of any kind. Was Captain America prepared to overthrow the government? Was that his plan for the first Civil War? I don't think so. I don't think Rogers really thought it through much beyond just permanently going rogue, even though his followers would pay for that choice dearly. But it feels like the writing under Hickman with the Avengers, and dealing with all this stuff, is using a level of maturity and thoughtfulness that is lacking from past writers we've talked about in this series, like Geoff Johns, Chuck Austen, Mark Millar, and Brian Michael Bendis. Mature comics and ideas have been around with these guys for well over a decade by the time Hickman came along. But he's the one, I feel, that actually grapples with these ideas, and does it properly for the first time since Kirk Busiek. Hickman feels like he's taking the Avengers to a whole new level. There are very serious and intelligent ideas being floated throughout Time Runs Out, about everything from the ethics of survival to nihilism and the nature or value in belief. For a very dark story, perhaps the darkest in all of Avengers history, I never hated reading it. It was at times miserable and even depressing, but it was enticing, mysterious, and interesting enough that I wanted to keep going. And by the time you get to what it's all building up to, that 2015 Secret Wars event, also written by Hickman, and the big blockbuster end of his time with the series, you realize the arc of his story was ultimately one of hope. In a lot of ways, the size and scale of Time Runs Out and Secret Wars reminds me a lot of a Lord of the Rings style epic. A big, long, and dark journey. One where you almost can't believe the heroes are going to make it out and win in the end. But they did, even if most of them did die and they were remade into new versions of themselves that don't quite remember what happened. We as readers and a few other characters remember, and that's what matters. Because Marvel was never quite the same after this story. And looking back on it, this really is one of my all-time favorite periods in Marvel's history, for better or worse. This time is full of new ideas, characters developing and moving forward, while also some of the more fun and epic crossover events Marvel has ever done. Everything about it is just very interesting. I could make multiple videos on each character's role in this story, especially key figures like Mr. Fantastic or Doctor Strange. So, in some ways, it doesn't really matter how many crossover events there were, or how many comics you are expected to read. At a certain point, if those comics are good and entertaining enough, if there's these philosophical and political ideas being explored, rock-solid character work overriding and surpassing pretty much everything done anywhere else in Avengers history, none of that matters. I love a lot of those old Avengers books we've talked about earlier in this series, but none of them even come close to broaching some of these ideas and themes Hickman explores in Avengers Volume 5. And then to top it all off, we also get some of the most memorable and beautiful art in Avengers history. There's a lot of names involved here, not only some we've talked about before in grading the Avengers, who really shine here, like Mike Deodato or Adam Kubert, but also pretty hefty talent relatively new to the Avengers, like the Neil Francis Yu, Salvador LaRocca, and Dustin Weaver. Combined with closely related new Avengers series being published at the time, and it's a very moving series of books giving the depth of narration going on here. These artists truly add something to the Avengers of this era. Given the content at hand, it was a real challenge consistently keeping these books feeling more epic than grim-dark. And I would say, on the whole, they achieved things quite miraculously. By the time things build up to Secret Wars, the story has become so much bigger than just one about the Avengers. Not only is it a big celebration of all things Marvel, not only does it do it in a way that I found fairly touching, but those stories explored ideas and character work that no other Avengers book in history has ever really touched on. It's not for everyone. There's problems left and right, and I do recognize that. We have so many books that are basically required reading for any of this to make sense, or for the payoff of Secret Wars to feel like payoff. For people who cut right to the event, a lot of that content is going to be lost on them. Likewise, I don't think people realize what it was like reading these books over the few years these stories were all rolling out. The slow, steady march of incursions was often quietly touched on in other stories and series. The grim reality at hand became harder and harder to ignore following stuff like Axis, where everything really just seemed to be falling apart in the world of Marvel. Things got dark, darker than they had ever been or ever will be, and I had no idea where the story was going from there. But with deft writing, a commitment to a larger narrative, and a strong focus on character work, Jonathan Hickman, in my opinion, pulled something off truly unique in Avengers history that no other writer has really achieved before or since, at least not for the Avengers. And yes, there are decisions along the way that reek of Marvel's fingerprints. The decision to kind of retire the Fantastic Four for a time, as well as revealing that the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver weren't really mutants during the Axis event. These were all Marvel playing games with their then divided movie rights with 20th Century Fox. But in spite of all of that, Jonathan Hickman's Avengers made me feel things, think about new ideas, and view decades-old characters in new ways that didn't feel forced or out of their character, given the overwhelming situation at hand. So on that note, as stated before, there are only 2 exact grades of any type allowed in grading the Avengers, to ensure we don't end up with a bunch of B grades or A grades or something. Therefore, I chose to give Time Runs Out, and only Time Runs Out, the equivalent grade to the original Avengers comics as created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. These 2 eras are very different and are going for completely different things, so they each got this grade for different reasons. Lee and Kirby are largely responsible for many of the traits, characters, and characteristics of the Avengers that hold up to this day. Hickman and his little army of artists, along with all the other editors and other creators involved in this project, including writers like Jason Aaron, Nick Spencer, and Rick Remender, who did some of the events and extra books we've talked about already. Well, these people were bold enough to take the Avengers in a truly new direction, covering this epic and fun ground that we hadn't seen before. This top-tier grade for the series, in my opinion, is well-deserved. This review is significant. There's a lot going on at once, and I have this rush of thoughts and feelings, just like last round. Because last round we had this big run with Jonathan Hickman. It lasted years, had all these tie-ins, and following it, Marvel was in a pretty good place from a creative standpoint. And it was decided that Avengers writing would be taken over by Mark Waid and a number of artists for a new series called All New, All Different Avengers. And here's where everything goes horribly wrong. Mark Waid is a fun writer with a lot of history in the world of comics. Waid had even written for the Avengers before, in round 13 for a few issues of the Avengers during the Onslaught saga. Those books weren't any good, but let's face it, given the circumstances of them, it didn't really matter who was writing it either. Mark Waid had also done guest spots in special issues of Avengers-related books by this point, quite a few in fact, and it felt like, on the whole, he wasn't a terrible choice to take over the Avengers, but one that, at the time, already feels a little dated. So I don't think the choice for him as an Avengers writer was a bad one on its own, not exactly. But I think he would have been more effective at his prime in the 90s, or at least that's what it feels like, when he was more fresh-faced. Nowadays, it instead feels like he's simply standing in the way of new talent at this point. I don't want to come down too hard on the writer, because I do like him, but no matter how you cut it, Waid was not a good choice for this particular roster of Avengers, to the extent it feels like just about any writer would have been better than him. That's a rough assessment, but this is one of the worst series of Avengers books ever put together. I suspect, without having any real evidence, to be clear, that Waid wasn't in charge of picking out who was going to be on this team. Looking over his body of work, he feels smarter than that, and would likely have opted for a more refined type of team. As we see in next round, that very much seems to be the case with another round of Avengers written by Mark Waid. But instead, here we have the worst roster of Avengers there's ever been. The entire existing team is largely dumped, with Iron Man and Vision only remaining. And while that's been done before, problems start compounding here. Sam Wilson returns to the team, but in his new moniker of Captain America, while Miles Morales, Kamala Khan, Sam Alexander, and Jane Foster all join the team as newcomers. And there's a lot wrong right out of the gate. The team feels alien, not only to us as readers and them as Avengers, but to each other. With no shared experiences common to the team, there isn't much of a drive or reason to root for these characters together. Individually, there is some history. Tony and Kamala know each other, these kids all know each other quite well, and there's this long history between Vision and Iron Man, obviously. But Vision is cold and indifferent in this story, deliberately so based on a baffling choice by Waid to make the character obviously evil at the very start of this series. And all that content largely devoted to the Avengers team dealing with this evil Vision. It heightens the sensation you get when reading these books of everything being wrong about the team. Jane Foster's Thor, by then carefully established by Jason Aaron to be a quiet, somber character, is inexplicably written as a happy-go-lucky and teen goofball, all while starting a romance with Sam Wilson that could very well be one of the worst written romances in all of Avengers history, were it not for all the troubles back in the 1970s. It is a confluence of bad, made only worse by stuff as simple as how this team gets together to begin with. They all just kind of awkwardly look at each other following their first adventure and just sort of agree to become the new Avengers, because that's the title of the book. It really doesn't feel like there's any other reason why the team would want to call themselves that, or why Tony thinks Miles, Kamala, and Sam are at all old enough or qualified to join the team. Don't get me wrong, we've consistently and certainly had new superheroes that are complete novices being taken in by the Avengers, and made a member of the team on the spot in the past. Usually, however, this is done incrementally, a new character here and there, and generally only one character at a time. Here, however, the established Avengers are completely outnumbered by the new Avengers, and not only that, they're teenagers. Far younger than the average age of any Avenger across the team history. It feels borderline irresponsible for the adults to let these kids serve on a team that goes up against such high-level threats. Or at least, a team that should be going up against high-level threats. This team doesn't ever actually do much to begin with. When Peter Parker was that young, it was stuff like his inexperience and the age difference between him and the Avengers that often prevented him from joining the team for that reason. So it feels very hypocritical and borderline immature of the adult characters to agree to work with these children in this specific capacity, and nothing of the comics really addresses that. Instead, it's all just about the drama, this forced, stale drama. Vision undermines the team, there's this romance that makes no sense, and other goofy nonsense dominates the first 6 issues of this comic. There isn't really anything memorable in terms of a villain or a story at play here ever. It's all just about Vision being a bad guy. And from there we go right into a comic that introduces Nadia Van Dyne for some reason, then a series of tie-ins of crossover events dealing with stuff like Pleasant Hill and Civil War II, which are all pretty pointless issues that do nothing for this team. And that's it. I cannot stress how little there is in terms of content to these 15 books, an annual, and a couple of bonus issues. That's a lot of comic book pages, and they are utterly wasted. Earlier in grading the Avengers, we talked about how Brian Michael Bendis wasted a lot of his time and potential with the team, but at least he had something in his books. Every once in a while you get a solid Bendis story or at least some moment of entertainment value. But this whole series is a dud from start to finish. These supposedly all new, all different comics, if anything, show off the worst traits of the 21st century modern Avengers, letting the story get consumed by this overwrought drama between team members while we focus way too much on crossover stories, all while using diversity as a shield. Because now we have to talk about all this too. You'll notice I haven't even bothered to mention this was all part of an effort to supposedly make the Avengers more diverse. I say supposedly because if you want more diversity in the tone and nature of your Avengers, Mark Waid didn't really feel like a sincere choice to get us in that direction. This approach to diversity reflects how Marvel was going about things in their all-new, all-different period, wanting to use more diverse characters without addressing the systemic problems within the industry itself. They wanted to give the Avengers a new coat of paint, pat themselves on the back, and call it a day. Instead, they suffered intense backlash they've since used as an excuse to not invest in diversity as much, and through all of this, it seems as though nobody is aware or wanted to acknowledge the very real history the Avengers have of a long and awesome attempt to make the comic book industry more diverse. We've been careful to point that out along the way of this series, with Black Panther long considered a member of the team and now its current member, and Monica Rambeau thoroughly dominating the 1980s, to the extent she also eventually became a leader of the Avengers. This fake move towards diversity in 2016 felt inauthentic, forced, and a little dishonest given the Avengers' history. That Monica was nowhere to be found on the team in favor of Marvel's latest pet characters shows how little attention was paid to actual Avengers history, or lore. Marvel was focused on themselves and their own weird internal little goals, far too much to care what would have worked best for this team. And in addition to all of that, Mark Waid was certainly not given enough time to let the Avengers exist and grow as a team before the tie-ins took over. And what little time he did get, he wasted on a story where the Vision turned into a monster. Finally, the art felt wildly inconsistent and feels way too cartoony. Mahmoud Asrar, Adam Kubert, and Dave McCraig set a decent tone for an Avengers book in theory. It reminds me a lot of Bendis' proper Avengers run, but it doesn't work with whatever tone Mark Waid at least appears to be going for. It's very difficult to assess that though, at least not fully, because I have trouble discerning what this team wants to be and what direction it wants to go in. It feels like they should be more laid back and fun, in which case Kubert and Asrar's pencils, along with McCraig's bi-coloring, would work for this series. But because Waid is all over the place in terms of tone, and it feels like the writing wants to be taken more seriously, while also just lacking a strong sense of identity in general, I have no idea what this team wanted to be, or how I'm supposed to feel. So it doesn't feel like any art would work with a comic like this. I mean, I know how the comic does actually make me feel. It makes me feel confused, angry, and bored. But that's not the intent of the book. I don't know what the intent of these books are. And that's a crazy thing to say about a full run of Avengers comics. The grade should be an F. In just about any other series it would have gotten it and deserved as much. Unfortunately, with urine-soaked entries in Avengers history like the Jim Shooter era or Heroes Reborn, Mark Waid's run still feels meaningfully better than both eras. It's not so much the all-new, all-different Avengers are all that much better than Shooter's era or Heroes Reborn. It's just that they aren't quite as embarrassing. So I'm going to comfortably give it the D grade. It is much worse than Bendis or Johns, and absolutely the worst of anything Avengers in the 21st century, but across the team's entire history, it's not the absolute low point. All New, All Different Avengers was a disaster, of epic proportions. The kind that makes it not much of a surprise the series was cancelled and rebooted within a year. What is surprising is what followed, as Mark Waid returned as a writer.
Things in last round for the all-new, all-different era of Avengers was rough, to say the least. The series had a lot of problems, and after just a year, it was cancelled. However, rather than give up on Waid entirely, perhaps knowing, as I suspected, that a lot of problems with last round's Avengers had more to do with Marvel than writer Mark Waid, the now beleaguered and widely criticized writer was given another chance to write the series for the year of 2017. So Mark Waid revamped the team with a new artist, Mike Del Mundo, some guest talent along the way, and a new roster, with the Avengers experiencing a vast improvement as a result. And it's a good thing that Marvel gave him this second chance, because Waid revamped the whole Avengers team with a new artist, Mike Del Mundo, some guest talent, and a new roster, with almost overnight the Avengers experiencing a vast improvement. Waid kept on Thor, Vision, and Captain America, but booted off everybody else, adding instead the Peter Parker Spider-Man, Nadia Van Dyne, who had been flirting with joining the team the year before anyways, and longtime Avenger Hercules. And just like last round, right out of the gate, the choice of who's on the team to begin with says so much, and in this case, in a very positive way. The Avengers of 2017, or Avengers Volume 7, feels like a much more polished roster. You have some of the new characters Marvel was focusing on post-Secret Wars, like Sam Wilson or the female Thor returning, but instead of a roster composed entirely of these new characters, Vision, Peter Parker, and Hercules are all there to provide their experience, expertise, and Avengers credibility. Hercules' history with the team and his big personality adds so much to the Avengers in a positive way, and allows for Thor to more assume a somber leadership role that feels much more appropriate for her character as she's been established in her own books, than the way she was written for Avengers Volume 6. Nadia is a newcomer and one of those young, up-and-coming heroes, just like how Kamala, Miles, and Sam were in the all-new, all-different Avengers, but this time, because there's only one of her, it doesn't feel like the team is in way over their heads. Instead, she's a welcome presence, a fun addition, rather than one randomly tacked on to a couple of Volume 6 issues, where she felt far more like a distraction or intrusion. The weakest character in the whole team is actually Spider-Man. I think the way Peter Parker gets written in Avengers comics too often opts for a more annoying character, rather than the fun and charming iteration of Spider-Man we better know from his solo comics. Outside of the new Avengers back in the early 2000s, Spider-Man in Avengers books is generally a source of tacky jokes and obnoxious behavior. Unfortunately, Avengers 2017 is a pretty solid example of that. At this point in Peter's history as a character, he is CEO of Parker Industries, a big, Stark-like company that Dan Slott was pushing for with the Amazing Spider-Man comics. That's used in an interesting way here for the Avengers, where Peter Parker, much like Tony Stark has done at various times, played host to the Avengers using his corporate headquarters. The idea of it, in principle, is fun, but in execution, Parker just comes off as being a little bit snobby, both inside and out of his Spider-Man costume. For whatever reason, the near-identical dynamics used on Tony Stark work for a character like Iron Man, but feel very off-putting and strange for a character like Spider-Man. Maybe it's because we just know Peter is not like this, and he's a lot warmer and open of a person than Tony ever was. So a lot of Peter's behavior in these Avengers books rings false, or worse, makes him feel like a nuisance. That being said, he's just one member of the team. Everyone else is pretty on point, and I don't want to overstate how badly Peter Parker is written. Because when you compare how Waid wrote the rest of the Avengers in Volume 6, Parker is still much better. Even the worst character in Avengers Volume 7, which would definitely be Peter Parker out of these Avengers, and he might not be great in this series, it still doesn't compare to the all-new, all-different Avengers, where its characters were written in such an aggressively bad way. I feel an incentive to, if anything, downplay the problems I'm talking about in terms of how Spider-Man is written in the Avengers of 2017, because there's a lot of amazing features to this run worth talking about. Mike Del Mundo is so good, and these books are bolstered with fun additional talent, which is especially prominent in all these side issues that are published with the Avengers. These side comics take a couple of forms. First, they include the event tie-in for Monsters Unleashed, which Marvel published as a side thing so that the tie-in felt less like a distraction for the main series and more of this fun optional side thing you can skip right by if you so desire. That was a great choice, but also there's this really fun flashback series of stories that take place and take us back to the days when the original Avengers quit and Captain America had to start all over with a new team of former villains. It's really fun that we go back to this classic point in Avengers history. Not only does Mark Waid feel at home with this flashback type content, but it feels pretty welcome in general. Very rarely in Avengers history do we go back to earlier moments in the team. But in the Avengers 2017, it shows us thoroughly why it might be a good idea to do so more in the future. A bunch of artists, including the notable talent of Mark Bagley, do this amazing job at making the classic Avengers era come to life in this story, while it fills in some of the details of a time period in Avengers history where additional content and development makes a lot of sense. These books address some of the transition between the original Avengers and the second team, which Stan Lee just kind of blew right by in his original usual breakneck pace back in the Silver Age. So it really works well at adding something to the story of the Avengers that truly wasn't there before. As for the Avengers of the present, it seems very clear to me that from the beginning, Marvel knew Jason Aaron would be taking over the Avengers for Volume 8, with some very big changes to come along with it. So Mark Waid seemed to have been given a lot of space to tell whatever stories he felt like, as long as he could contain them within 2017. So because he knew he only had 1 year to tell a story, and he could kind of pre-plan everything, Waid was able to fit a lot into that year. With a firm end date, it feels like he spent a lot of time budgeting his time well compared to the all-new, all-different Avengers, or indeed, most modern Avengers writers. And because of that, we get content in Volume 7 that feels concise, clear, and packed full of adventures. In one short series of comics, we get the modern Avengers going up against Doom, various iterations of Kang the Conqueror, monsters, and then things kind of fizzle out with Secret Empire. It's a bit of a letdown as Marvel does keep its tie-in as part of the series for this event, and it feels like it causes the Avengers series to just sort of piddle out into nothing. But at its core, this is a series that looks good, has far more polished character work, and really worked at showcasing how Mark Waid can be a fun Avengers writer. To that end, even as Jason Aaron took over the main series, Waid remains a pretty consistent Avengers presence, and a fairly welcome one at that. Through side stories like Avengers Worlds Collide or No Surrender, Mark Waid's ideas and vision of the Avengers would continue on long past 2017. We are more or less folding those additional comics and stories into this review. They feel consistent in terms of art and quality. Alex Ross continues to paint a lot of those covers, for example, and most importantly, they continue the spirit and values of his Avengers run from 2017. Which, to be honest, is great. For those that aren't a fan of Jason Aaron and his latest take on the Avengers, Waid's presence serves as a nice way to keep Avengers books that feel a little more like the classic team. Aaron's Avengers are all about these changes and big ideas, which we'll be talking about next round, while Waid feels more like what the Avengers have been more historically. Now last round I talked about how Waid kind of felt like a dated choice for the Avengers, but when we do it like this, and when we have a new writer who's kind of breaking new ground and taking the team in a different direction, suddenly Waid as a more classic writer who keeps the Avengers pulled back towards their roots feels very welcome indeed. Aside from some dud moments here and there with Spider-Man and the end of the 2017 original series, this is a fun read. It's a huge moment of reprieve for Mark Waid after getting 2 of the lowest grades in all of grading the Avengers. It is very nice that this talented writer With a long history in the comic book industry, and after decades of being dicked around by Marvel when it comes to the Avengers comics, finally got a chance to write a proper series of books for this team. Though not perfect, Avengers 2017 is so much better than Waid's history with the Avengers. This run of comics is an example of fine work by Waid, Del Mundo, and the others involved with Avengers. After the disaster of 2016, this creative team, including Waid, who is largely responsible for that disaster, managed to give the Avengers a new and much needed breath of life and boost of energy. I imagine a lot of people completely missed this run due to its short publication time and everyone having a really deserving bad taste in their mouth from the all-new, all-different Avengers nonsense. But I would recommend people maybe set aside their expectations and thoughts about Avengers 2016 to give Avengers 2017 a solid chance. I had so much fun with these comics and think other people would too. It represented a huge step in the right direction for the Avengers, and serves as final, undeniable proof that Mark Waid can, in fact, write a proper Avengers story when given the opportunity. So, after an astounding 23 rounds, we are finally here at the present day with Jason Aaron's Revengers. A long run of comics that have been going for a few years now, but very much still feels like an active thing. That presented an interesting challenge to this series, with me basically just having to constantly stay on top of the Avengers throughout the rest of these videos coming out, checking up with the current comics to make sure my grades were up to date. And that was important to do because it did change my grades, and as such other grades over time, with quite a few Avengers stories having come out since I started this series. When I started grading the Avengers, the series was in the middle of this whole thing with Moon Knight, and since then they've had a story arc with the Phoenix Force, and then this whole big crossover event thing in the form of Heroes Reborn. Aaron seems to be with the Avengers for a bit, and this won't be changing anytime soon. I am reasonably confident though at this point that my final grade for this run will be a bit firm going forward. It's stayed consistent since the Moon Knight story, but it is worth noting things could change. His comics could really become different in terms of quality from here on out. And it is very possible that this grade and all others will one day be out of date. This was always going to happen no matter what I did. Avengers history is ongoing and fluid as long as there are new comics coming out, and I prefer that would be the case. And also, the newer the books are, the harder they are to talk about in a historical context to begin with. So these last few rounds of the series are definitely more contemporary looks compared to the rest of grading the Avengers. This is just the best I can do based on all information available to me, and we're going to go with this review. There's no point in delaying it since there's never going to be a time where it's easy to review the Avengers series as a whole. And these things that I'm talking about do matter. The newer Jason Aaron Avengers stories definitely had an effect on my overall grade, like I said. It lowered things ever so slightly. Aaron's Avengers are a lot of things, both good and bad. One thing that fascinates me is that when people talk about what they like or don't like about Jason Aaron's Avengers, they tend, as I find, to focus on only a handful of things, completely ignoring huge parts of the series and stuff that it really consumes the attention of other readers. So I find one reviewer who really seems to like this whole idea of the Squadron Supreme, introduced in Aaron's books as puppets of Mephisto, as being this sort of satire of the New 52. And while I personally think that parody stuff is trivial and barely an important part of the Avengers series, to this reviewer, it's the most important aspect of Aaron's book. Other people focus a lot on Aaron's newer roster, consisting of a wide range of characters from Avengers history, like Thor, Iron Man, Captain America, Black Panther, She-Hulk, Captain Marvel, and newcomers Ghost Rider and Blade, ignoring that Aaron also created a whole new team of Avengers that apparently existed back in caveman times. And as for the critiques of the present-day roster, it is, in my opinion, one of the strongest to date. A nice balance of characters from throughout Avengers history, while also featuring fun choices, like the decision to make Black Panther the head of the team, allowing Carol, Tony, and Steve to sort of take on a more supporting role, while also setting aside all their tremendous baggage with each other and horrible decisions they've made over the years. We also get a new base for the Avengers Mountain, which is actually the frozen corpse of a long-dead Celestial. Aaron presents us with this series featuring a whole new set of Avengers mythology. New headquarters, a team utterly divorced from American politics and now far more firmly associated with Wakanda and the rest of the world, new ideas about why humans in this world have these superpowers to begin with, and what that all means. I love it. The choice to make humanity's unique role in Marvel's universe more of a cosmic accident than us being super special starflower children is so much better, and is a far more elegant execution of existing Marvel cosmic mythology. These changes make the narrative a bit more of something where humanity and its path forward are kind of on them. We as the human race have been given all these amazing gifts, and it's up for us what we might do with them. It's a solid message. If you can't tell yet, I really like Jason Aaron's Avengers, which is a bit of a problem because, as best as I can tell, most fans and critics simply do not. That gets into what I was saying though earlier about how people tend to focus on individual aspects of the series without considering everything on the whole. What's worse is nobody ever seems to talk about the most important parts of these Avengers. Mainly that Aaron takes a ton of time to just let the Avengers breathe. Between all these stories that by now are pretty par for the course for the Avengers in terms of epicness, Aaron does something few other Avengers writers do, which is let their characters take a break between these big epic stories and react to them. Whole issues might be devoted to the Avengers going to a hot spring together. For one book, Carol takes Robbie Reyes out for a fishing trip because he had a really rough time with their most recent adventure and he's new to the team. It's a beautiful moment that I wouldn't trade up for just about any other moment in Avengers history. It's also a good example of Carol being consistently written far more human and warm than just about any other writer in Avengers history. These little moments, while they have happened in past books, feel so much rarer across Avengers history compared to how Aaron so consistently takes time for these things. And that matters so much to me, compared to just about any other critique people have for the series. Avengers, at its core, is about a team of characters, so how these characters are written and interact with each other matters so much. So when people have gripes about the identity of the roster, the books aren't making whatever political point they're projecting into things, or start nitpicking it, I think they've lost sight of what the Avengers are really about. The team should never be focused on parodying the Justice League or telling the most epic stories possible. It should always be about quality character work. There's a reason why the most memorable thing in all of Avengers Age of Ultron, even though it's this big expensive movie, is all the Avengers at a party, rather than anything with Ultron. So even in the relatively weaker, newer stories like some of the stuff with Moon Knight and Phoenix, well, in between those issues, we're still getting all this great character work. And because that's done so well, everything else to me, be it good or bad, is either icing on the cake or easily ignorable. The Avengers of 10,000 BC, or whatever they're called, are great, and I especially like the standalone issues we got once in a while that focuses on one member of the team individually, or that great story where Tony Stark gets sent back into time and has to live in that setting for a single book. These books are solid writing, example of perhaps some of the strongest single issues in all of Avengers history. Structurally well written, but also very creative in their ideas being fronted. Even a relatively weaker story like Moon Knight is full of ideas and imagery that I just love. And yeah, it's not the strongest story in the world, but I sure enjoyed myself. Between Moon Knight running around, seizing all these domains of power at the beginning of the story, seeing an Earth conquered and controlled by Khonshu, and the fun of the Egyptian deity slowly going mad as he battles endless waves of Mephisto, there's so much to enjoy here. It's an excellent Avengers arc that easily beats out entire runs that we've talked about in this series before. Because this is, at the core, what the Avengers have always been. A quirky set of imaginative adventures, but now with better character writing than perhaps anything outside of Hickman's work. And of course, Hickman's Avengers are an entirely different, higher quality breed. And that's okay, he was going for this big, dark story, and Jason Aaron's writing is clearly trying to be more fun. It, in my opinion, seeds very wildly at that fun. I had so much joy in my heart when I read these Avengers books, and that continues to be the case every time I read a new one. I remember being skeptical about a lot of these things when the Avengers of Jason Aaron's era was all new. The Avengers Mountain, She-Hulk's character changes, S.H.I.E.L.D. transitioning over to the Agents of Wakanda, the Caveman Avengers, but it all, in my opinion, was very well handled. It certainly helps that this art does such a great job at working with Aaron's tones. With an army of extremely talented names backing him up, including notable favorites of mine Sarah Pichelli, Ed McGuinness, David Marquez, and Andrea Sorrentino, along with Jason Masters, Stefano Caselli, Luciano Vecchio, Eric Arcanaglia, Paco Medina, Mark Morales, and Javier Garon. Along with many others, they bring this dynamic visual flair to this era of Avengers I just love. The style of these artists tends to go for a more cartoony direction, and though that fits with the general tone of the Avengers, especially as Jason Aaron's writing them, these artists do a pretty good job at also making things feel more epic or darker when the series calls for it. Historically, Aaron is a pretty dark and weird writer, and was an interesting choice for the Avengers from the beginning. Every once in a while we do get a bit of that dark flair, and he does go places with this series. It's not anything nearly as dark or formidable as Time Runs Out, and again, doesn't really feel like it wants to be that, nor is it as smart as that, but it manages to balance all these ideas and different tones better than Hickman ever really did. It's often funnier than most other Avengers books from before, and of course it does all that excellent character development stuff that I really appreciate. I feel a little alone on this one. I know that most comments I read from the comic book community is a lot more down and critical of this era of Avengers than I ever will or can be. Every time I hear people critique these books, though, I just think about how important the character development scenes are and how lacking they feel in past Avengers books. I just love the stuff Stan Lee, Roy Thomas, Roger Stern, Kurt Busiek, and Jonathan Hickman did with the Avengers, but they don't ever spend time on this stuff. We might get a glimpse of the Avengers' daily routine before they're thrust into the next adventure, but Jason Aaron devotes time to actually show us what the Avengers are up to in between these big stories. He lets his series take a moment and reflect on things. He lets there be a reaction in the team and the world around them to the events that happen in his story. If more Avengers books did stuff like that, then maybe they would also get good grades. And I understand perfectly well that these books have problems. They go for these big, epic stories and just sort of quickly abandon everything near the end. Aspects of the mythology feel drawn out, some characters have gotten a lot more development than others, and worst of all, some of the dialogue is just plain awful. Jason Aaron's Avengers is a weird combination where a lot of the character work and overall stories are decent, but the actual dialogue, especially these Joss Whedon-style one-liners all the Avengers have throughout Jason Aaron's time in the series, are just so bad. Jason Aaron is not good at this type of dialogue, and never really has been. These little bits of dialogue are generally unwelcome, and by far my least favorite aspect of his Avengers. They often come across as out of character, and when I talk about the series being funny, I sure as hell am not talking about these quippy little lines. They really take me out of the series, and absolutely lowered the overall grade. So don't get me wrong, his books are far from perfect. However, the thing is, Aaron's Avengers does a lot of stuff that other Avengers books in the past simply don't. They don't care about following up on their own stories. They don't let their characters go fishing, even for a few pages. They certainly don't have an imaginative new headquarters and an exciting new leader who earned his place in that role, or a bunch of very interesting new ideas for the series. Jason Aaron does all these things and more. So yes, his books are flawed, but not so flawed that it overrides the stuff that it does incredibly well. People in media have a tendency not to like the most recent creative teams on a franchise, and I'm going to push a little bit that that's going on here. Most criticisms I've seen against the Avengers seem to be less about the quality of certain choices in the writing or the art, and more about people not getting what they expected out of the series. But if we're going by the quality, if we're going by how fun the villains are, how cool and memorable the stories have been, and how well the team is written, by and large, Jason Aaron does it better than most historical Avengers writers for the core series, beaten out by only a handful of Titans. Now, of course, everyone is welcome to disagree with me. In fact, no grade in this little run of videos we've done has gone without dispute from somebody. It feels especially relevant for a run like this that I admit has a lot of pros and cons to it. It feels like something like this is going to be polarizing, so I really don't expect everyone to agree with me. I love this run of Avengers, but I love it in spite of a lot of flaws, and I recognize that. For everything it does right, I do think it has some of the worst dialogue in Avengers history, for example. But it speaks to me enough that I just don't care about the flaws nearly as much as I care about the strengths. So I went with my heart and gave it a good grade. I hope people can understand and respect that, because there you have it. Those are my grades and thoughts on the entire core series run of Avengers comics.